@board_NC, and you can follow the meeting online and see all of our materials by going to SBE meetings at www.ncpublicschools.org. For our visitors and those listening online, today's agenda involves our board discussions on the agenda items, and tomorrow's agenda is the official meeting when the board will vote on its action items. We're delighted to begin this meeting with a special welcome to our new State Board of Education student advisor, Miss Lily Seymour from Haywood County Schools and the Haywood County Early College. Lily, we're delighted to have you. We're so proud of you and what you and your classmates are achieving in Haywood County, and we look forward to your participation in our meetings to come. Would you all join me in welcoming Lily? Thanks so much. And through the North Carolina Schools Superintendents Association Winter Leadership Conference is being held this week, we do have with us for this month's state board meeting a number of superintendents. First, Dr. Linda Carr, Superintendent of Washington County Schools, Dr. John Stover, Superintendent of Rockingham County Schools. If you're present and a local superintendent, could you stand, please? So Valerie, I noticed I missed one of your colleagues. Could you only called out two? Who is the third?
What's Sam that's in your name?
I'm Mark Sell, 8th Region from Swain County. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate it, sir. We're also delighted to have with us Mr. Henry Mercer of the Wilson County Board of Education, who will be joining us later this year. Mr. Mercer, thank you for, would you stand please so we can recognize you? Thank you so much for being with us. And later today we'll have Dr. Kelly Withers, Superintendent of Rowan Salisbury Schools, who will be sharing the work of her district as part of our agenda for this meeting. We appreciate the work of all local superintendents and local board members. We're also honored today to have with us Mr. Fred Wapples from Rowan Salisbury Schools, along with a group of juniors and seniors from East Rowan High School. The theme for their visit is Respect Our Differences, as they explore opportunities for reaching across different viewpoints to understand one another, something we can all learn from. If you're in that group and present today, could you please stand so we could recognize you and thank you, or are they on their way?
They're coming up the elevator, is what I would tell.
Perfect. Then we will recognize them when they get here. Thank you, Dr. Peach-Morgan. So board members, you're reminded that it's our duty to avoid conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest as we handle the work of this board. Does any member of the board know of any conflict of interest or any appearance of conflict with respect to any matters coming before us at this meeting? If so, please state them for the record, and if during the meeting you become aware of an actual or apparent conflict of interest, please bring the matter to the attention of the chair. It would then be your duty to abstain from participating in discussion on the matter and from voting on the matter. Colleagues, you've received the agenda for this meeting, had an opportunity to review it. I ask if there's any requests for changes to the agenda. Hearing none, I request a motion for approval of the November 30th and December 1st, 2022 agenda. Motion by Mr. Keenan, second by Mr. Blackburn. Any discussion? Hearing none, Dr. Petrie-Martin.
Dr. Oxenine.
Yes.
Mrs. Kamnitz.
Yes.
Mr. Keenan.
Yes.
Mr. Hull.
Yes.
Dr. Tipton Rogers. Mrs. White.
Yes.
Mr. Blackburn.
Yes.
Mr. Ford. Treasurer Falwell. Lieutenant Governor Robinson. Vice Chair Duncan.
Yes.
Chair Davis.
Yes. Motion carries. We have an agenda. Thank you so much. We'll now proceed immediately to the student learning and achievement discussions chaired by Ms. Jill Kamnitz. Ms. Kamnitz.
Thank you, Chair Davis. We start off this morning, as we have been doing of late, with an update from the K-12 Science and Healthful Living Standards team. Lots to report this month, as science particularly has been moving at warp speed, really. So Dr. Day, I'll turn it over to you.
Good morning. Thank you for allowing us this time to bring you updates as we do each month. As a reminder, this process follows State Board Policy SUS 012 so that the system is very uniform and formalized as we go across all content areas through a hybrid approach to this manual. As soon as the board approved the manual in February, we got going. Typically review has a full year and revision has a full year, and we are doing the 2 years worth of work in about 15 or so months. So all the steps are there, it's just a hybrid approach for these two content areas. So we'll start off with science and provide some explanation of completed actions since the last time we were in front of you, and then talk about next steps. We are very excited to share today the first draft of the proposed K-12 science standards. The standards writing team completed their work, and so those draft standards are ready for another round of feedback. Those surveys were released about 2 weeks ago to the field, and we will continue those steps. So it's a very cyclical process. When we first did the feedback loop with the current standards, we sent out 2 surveys for PSUs and all stakeholders, and that is what we are doing with these draft standards. So they are going out for feedback and review, and we will receive that feedback in a few weeks from PSU specifically, and then all stakeholders. We also want to emphasize that this is a first draft. We still have a ways to go before we get to a finalized draft in which you would take action on that. So we still have several steps between these standards that you'll see today, these draft standards, and the finalized draft. For next steps, we will collect the data from those surveys, and the Office of Learning Recovery will help us organize that data, and then the data will go back to the Data Review Committee, and that is the same process that we used before a few months ago when we gathered data on the current standards. I want to take a time to thank the groups that have been a part of this work. The DRC, the Data Review Committee, which was a group of educators as well as the standards writing team. Another group of educators volunteered their time to help with this process. We facilitate the process at DPI, but it's the educators that do the work of reviewing and revising these standards. So we are very, very grateful to this amazing group of educators. They're very dedicated to science and the science teaching and learning across the state. I also want to thank the K-12 science team and Dr. Aiken for doing an exceptional job of moving the process. We're doing a hybrid approach very quickly, and they have stuck to the manual and made a solid process and put that in place. I'd also like to introduce 2 guests that we have with us today. We have Jessica Enlow, who is representing the Data Review Committee. She serves on the biology team and is from Cabarrus County Schools. We also have Mr. Dylan Crockett, who is representing the standards writing team. He was a part of the middle grades team, and he is coming from Lee County Schools. And they're going to help over the next couple slides show the process and the product that came from these 2 committees and what happened from step 1 to where we are today with a draft of the proposed K-12 science standards. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Aiken and our 2 guests.
Thank you, Dr. Day. Good morning, Chairman Duncan, Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, and Troy. Our audience across the state, we are very excited to be here. Likewise with Dr. Day, I would like to start by thanking, we had close to 60 educators from across the state that have been a key component of this. We had community members that have played an important role as business leaders, and certainly to the thousands of stakeholders, educators, and community members who have participated through the survey process and provided that feedback. This doesn't happen without everyone being a part of this. As Dr. Day mentioned, this has been a very step-by-step process. We started with the review phase, which included first gathering research from across the country, international, pulling in standards, looking at various science frameworks to provide a structure. It included conducting the 2 surveys that Dr. Day mentioned, one for any stakeholder across the state, and then one specifically designed for our PSUs, our charter schools and districts, to provide feedback from their particular lens. It also included conducting 8 regional focus groups, which consisted of educators from that particular region, one for each of the state board areas, and then we conducted an additional virtual focus group for our charter schools. It also included conducting one-on-one interviews with community members, representatives from institutes of higher education, some educators from district administrative levels. And then all of that was put together with the help of the Office of Learning Recovery, who I do want to give a shout out to that entire team. That process was very helpful. It provided a very data-looking lens, both at the quantitative data as well as the qualitative data that came through, which was also a critical piece to this. So those 2 sections, that qualitative and quantitative, was put together and provided to the data review team, whose responsibility was then to take a look at it, look at the trends, look at the overall pieces of information, and then to come to some conclusions and recommendations that would be handed to the second team, the writing team, to figure out what was best in terms of a revision process. So at that point, I'd kind of like to turn it over to Ms. Enlow to talk a little bit about kind of how that process worked. They actually started their work the first full week of September, I believe, where we had some in-person work, and then they actually continued working virtually as a team. So I'm going to stop for a second and let Jessica kind of share.
Thank you for allowing me some of your time this morning. So as you know, I was on the biology DRC, and my experience was that our DPI consultants guided us on what data and research was available for us to review as the professionals in the room and consider. And so they asked us to take ownership of the data review process on our own and approach that by looking at the stakeholder feedback in parallel with the recent research from reputable sources in science education, in addition to a cross-state analysis. We really truly focused on the qualitative feedback compared to the quantitative feedback because it was imperative that we had context for that quantitative data so that we understood what our stakeholders wanted in their future of science education in their classrooms across North Carolina. And so we made using all the data, we made our best recommendations for keeping, modifying, or removing standards as they were written currently. And that's our draft that we have now. The conclusions that we made were really organically organized into vertical teams because some of the things that were changing in certain grade levels or grade spans would further impact either lower grade levels or higher grade levels. So we organized organically into those vertical teams to ensure there was integrity in that vertical alignment that's so important to the child's education K-12. And that included considering within the K-12, the framework for K-12 science education, the idea of including the science and engineering practices within the standard nomenclature.
So just to give an example of some of the work that the Office of Learning and Recovery did for us, I wanted to provide two examples of that. So on the slides is one example of a quantitative chart that they provided, and then one looking at some of the qualitative data. The chart on the left-hand side represented the overall percent of changes or removals requested. What you'll see going down the one axis are the grade levels or content areas. PS, by the way, stands for physical science. Down at the very end, you'll see an E-E, and that is for earth and environmental. And then going across, you'll see what are decimal numbers, but they represent percentages. So it goes from basically 0% to the 1, and the 1 being 100%. And one of the pieces of feedback that we got was that when it came to the content and the concepts that are in these various grade levels and courses, there were not a lot of requests to change or remove. And what you're seeing is actually the percent of times that there was a request to change or remove a standard or objective within that. And so really none of them do you see anything more close to 30% where people were asking for there to be a change in the content of those particular courses. So that was something that was an obvious trend that we really tried to think about. At the same time, as Ms. Enlow mentioned, we certainly looked at qualitative data, and the chart on the other side is an example of one of the questions that was in the focus group, which was actually also asked in the interviews, which was whether the respondent thought that the standards were concise and clearly articulated. And in this case, what OLR did for us was count the number of times that any of those kind of responses were included. And obviously one of the things that we saw was that it was a close call between yes and no, and to whether they thought that the standards were clear and easy to understand. And then there were also a number of options for how to improve that. And that was something that the DRC noted, and we're going to talk a little bit about how they kind of communicated that. But it was also something that the writing team really focused on when they thought, okay, what changes do need to be made, even if we're not making changes in large ways to the content. That didn't necessarily mean that there were not requests for some improvements and revisions. So one of the big pieces was obviously the DRC giving the writing team kind of those overarching summaries and conclusions. And I'd like to ask Emily to kind of come back up and talk about how the grade spans and the courses went through creating some of these summaries.
So as you can see here on the screen, this is an example of a high-level narrative about what the major changes were within the grade span for K2. That was also developed for K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and each individual course at the high school level. So as a DRC member, we worked diligently over 2 days to weigh the stakeholder feedback against the research and, as I mentioned before, the state-by-state analysis in order to truly come to a solid consensus on the recommendations we were gonna make to the, standards writing committees, based on trends in research and evidence in research. And to develop the best product for that standards writing team, we worked remotely evenings to make sure that this high-level draft communicated exactly what they needed to do to honor the request of our stakeholders and to make North Carolina comparable in the state-by-state analysis. And so this is an example of a high-level narrative that shows the big things that were asked for from our stakeholders in research, including, for example, some of the changes to language, the ideas of real-world applications, and how to contextualize the content that students were learning.
And on the next slide is another piece of the documentation that was required as part of this process that came through the manual. So it's important to note that even when the DRC was making recommendations, they still had to have a tracking of where those recommendations were coming from based on what. And on the screen before you now is a screenshot again of looking at more of a K2 lens. And what you'll see is in the first column, we just gave them literally the standards and objectives that are currently in the 2009 standards. Then they were asked to draw a conclusion as to whether that particular objective should stay as is, whether it should be modified, and they were given the choice of a slight modification or a more significant modification, or if in fact it should be removed. The color coding just on the screen for you, green was go, so keep as is. We had 2 shades of blue, and then red was sort of stop, that one needs to go away. But then on the next 3 columns, they did have to explain where did that recommendation or conclusion come from. So they could turn to looking at data sources that were provided by OLR, if there was research trends they saw, and or supporting research that had been provided through the research phase that we conducted prior to. And they might put all 3 where there were places. So this was done for every single standard and objective going across K-12. They had to provide an explanation for what their recommendation was. So all of this work was encapsulated in the final report and then provided to the standards writing team, which began its work in early October. So there were 4 kind of overarching themes that we noticed as we looked through the report. And again, I'm going to kind of ask Ms. Enlow to come up and talk a little bit about it. One of the trends was that we showed in that one graph that by and large, when it came to the content and the concepts that are currently in the standard course of study, there was not a lot of push to make major changes, maybe location. Certainly we talked about clarification of the wording, but in terms of the overall breadth of what is in our standard course of study, there was not a desire by the field to make many changes. We did talk about the fact that there was a request to look at providing some real world context. We talked about workforce development, thinking about what it is we want our students to do with science. It's great to know it, but if you can't do anything with it, we really haven't accomplished a lot. That was a major theme that kind of came through. The other one was we recognized that it's 2009 and we're now in 2022, almost 23. The field certainly had some requests that we update the framework basis, and the research has come out since then. Understandable, it's a big piece of why we are taking the blended approach. And then, of course, there was some requests, especially with the qualitative part, about really trying to refine that vertical alignment. As Ms. Enlow said, making sure that we get K-12, that we're building on the student skill set. So I'd like to turn it over, I think, one last time to Ms. Enlow to kind of talk about how they went through coming up with those trends.
So I'll mirror some of the same major topics and things we saw. So in the stakeholder feedback, there truly was, they indicated a readiness for the inclusion of science and engineering practices, and in their ask for the real world applications of the content that students were learning. They asked us to elevate the standard to be more clear in the application of the content, because the students should be doing the things in the discipline of science and engineering while they're learning the concepts. They should be tethered together. And if you're unfamiliar with the science and engineering practices, you can look at the draft and see a lot of those embedded, but truly they're just transferable skills. They're interdisciplinary practices. They're durable skills. They mirror the work of the portrait of the graduate. They really do. And so we talk about the workforce development piece. This already sets us up for including that in the standards so that the work happens in the curriculum instruction and the teaching and learning. And so that is information I think is important for you to know as stakeholders in North Carolina as well, that this was an ask of our stakeholders because they want the real world pieces to come into play K-12.
So what basically happened at the end of September is we took all this information, created a final report, and then we launched our standards writing team. We went to Cullowhee, and we were able to have two and a half, almost 3 days, where we essentially locked them in a room and said, we need you to start writing. And they did a fantastic job, and Mr. Crockett's here to represent their work, but I do want to commend them in both teams. I would want the state to know both of these groups started before 8 o'clock every day, and oftentimes even after we ended the time and said, okay, it's 5:30, stop, they went, got a bite, came back, and continued working. And many times, like we could see in some of the Google Docs, it's a neat little thing. You can go in and see when the last time someone opened it. Those documents were opened at 11 p.m., 12 p.m., and they were starting again at 7. So I commend all of them for their passion and their energy. Similar to how we sort of structured the data writing committee, the standards writing team was put into grade spans for high school courses. They started by reviewing the work that had been done and the research provided to them. And then they began to think about what are the revisions that need to be made, the edits. And like Ms. Enlow said, there was a lot of that vertical conversations because it's a domino effect. You make a change here, you can't just make it in isolation. So they began to really work vertically. They would meet, they'd go back to their groups, come back. It's kind of like an accordion effect. And then one of the things that is worth highlighting, and I know we're going to highlight it in a little bit, is the work alongside our colleagues at the Office of Exceptional Children. Really working to make sure that the extended standards that we roll out for our students come out together. One of the most fascinating things was having those groups of educators at the same table and the background that was being shared and the opportunities for that kind of conversation. You don't see very often. And I will say that they all took advantage of it. I happen to be sitting near the K2 group a lot, and just listening to them really talk about how does this work for all students was awesome, and it was powerful. So I do want to thank them for being there and wanting to be a part of this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Dylan here in a second, ask him to talk a little bit about some of their work. One thing I did want to share, just as an example for the board and for the audience, when we got done, this was not something that we showed initially. This was something we didn't create until after the work was already done. But we took a step back and said we knew that some of the goals were trying to be more concise, trying to make sure we didn't make major changes to the breadth. And it ended up, overall, at least in terms of the 2009 standards and the current draft, obviously the numbers could change, but the current draft, the total breadth really did stay very similar in terms of what the amount of concepts and skills that we were asking our students to cover. We did increase by 2 in terms of the standards as of right now. Again, that number could change depending on the feedback that we get. But the number of actual objectives within that actually dropped as we tried to be more concise, what really was duplicate work, that kind of thing. So it ended up just kind of giving you a current status of the total numbers by grade and by course, and then just sort of totality. So one of the things they had to create, obviously as a writing team, was what would be the draft standards. So on the next slide, I'm going to kind of ask Mr. Crockett to share a little bit of the process that they went through at NCAT, and then kind of show and talk through kind of what's been created here. And we did provide, this is a middle school example. They're all modeled very similarly. But Mr. Crockett, I'm going to kind of let you take over.
Thank you. So for the standards writing team, we received 2 different reports from the data team. We received that high-level summary as well as a standard by standard and objective by objective summary for what the stakeholders suggested the new standards look like. We also received a body of science education research that showed what science concepts are developmentally appropriate for students at each grade span to learn, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, and in high school. If you take a look at the snapshot of just one standard in 8th grade, you'll notice that there are 3 pieces of anatomy to the standard. There's a strand, a standard, and the objectives that follow. In the K-12 science curriculum, there are 3 overarching groups of standards. There are earth science standards, life science standards, and physical science standards. Within that, each strand could be considered a theme or a major topic within each of those 3 branches of science. And while each grade level K-12 might not look at every strand from every branch of science, the strands spiral, K-12. So each team was able to look at what pieces of science are reflected in the standards that would build upon each other. we were conscious of creating vertical alignment between every team, and although we were working within our own team to create this draft of standards, we had conversations with each other team. So while I was on the 6-8 team, we spoke with the 3-5 team, each of the high school teams, to make sure that the material appropriately builds through K-12. 6-8, of course, is an integrated science approach. So students at each of those grade levels have a little bit of each major area of science until they start to branch out at the high school level. So for this strand, matter and its interactions, although that might not be the topic that you study in each grade level, that's something that students will learn about from K through 12 at various points in the curriculum. This particular standard is looking at properties of matter. That's something that students learn about in elementary school, 6th grade, 8th grade, and in high school at varying levels of depth. When you take a look at the objectives, that's where we were really focused on how does the language reflect the research that's coming out from science education researchers, and how does that reflect the stakeholder feedback. We were given several different states, other states' examples of standards to look at as guidance, as well as the Next Generation Science Standards, which is a national body of science standards from which we derive those science and engineering practices. If you see the first objective, the underlined portion, is the science and engineering practice that has been assigned to this objective. The previous iteration of the standards from 2009 did not include these practices, but as Dr. Aiken and Jessica mentioned, it's these science and engineering practices that move us forward and what science instruction will look like for our students. And that was a very serious task that we had to do to envision how we wanted to move what teaching looks like for the subject in the state. If this draft ends up being what looks like the standards that you all will have a chance to take action on later in the year, this will be a large leap forward for how our students are learning science. These practices, so for example this one, construct an argument. As Dr. Aiken and Jessica said, constructing an argument based on evidence is a transferable skill and a durable skill. And when we think about our students entering the workforce, it's not simply enough for them to be successful to simply know science, but it's important that they are able to do science. As those industries grow throughout the state, the standards as they've been revised here will help us better do that in the classroom.
And again, I want to thank both of our guests. Ms. Enlow and Mr. Crockett represent, again, over 60 educators who were heavily involved in this work and continue to be involved in this work. And so at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Juma McCoy, our colleague from Office of Exceptional Children, who again, this partnership was new, but I am very excited about what it could mean moving forward for all of our sets of academic standards. So Ms. McCoy, I'll give it to you.
Good morning, everyone. I think I'm more excited than they are because typically we're 1 year behind their process and we don't come before you till a year later. And so I want to thank our Senior Director Sherry Thomas, Tammy Howard, and Christy Day for really making this happen. The value that our teachers who teach the adapted curriculum or who have our students on extended content standards was so appreciative to work alongside the content experts and to hear the rich conversations that were occurring and to hear their thought process. And so our lead consultant, Matthew Martinez, worked with them the entire time and worked closely with them. And I attended and participated in some of the activities. So I am so excited to be before you and sharing our information. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about who the students are because we followed the exact same process, which is what we typically do, but we do it 1 year later. So these students, students who participate on the extended content standards or the alternate academic achievement standards set an expectation of performance where they can differ in complexity and grade level academic standards. And so these students, we really should be only looking at 1% of the population. They are not our typical all grade spans. And so they are students who are under the Office of Exceptional Children and require an individualized education program. Next slide, please. So the state of North Carolina offers 3 criteria listed with this table for identifying students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. And again, these are your students with the moderate to severe cognitive delays. And so we have guidance documents that are available online for how IEP teams can go through and use a decision on how these students are identified. And for the state of North Carolina, our IEP teams must look at these 3 criteria to have a student placed on the extended content standards. An important item to notice is that these students do not receive a regular high school diploma, but a certificate of completion. And they can have up to 22 in order to complete that. Next slide, please. And again, as you see here, the comparison, you have 99% of majority of the students participate on the standard course of study. And that also includes some of our students who have exceptionalities. And then there's only 1%, which the federal government indicates should be really participating on the alternate achievement standards. And those decisions are made by the IEP team. Next slide, please. So these students, who are they and what do they look like? We operate from the least dangerous assumption of all students can learn. And so they do have the ability to learn. Now they may need repeated instruction, they may need individualized support, they may need more practice and opportunities to learn the content, but they can learn. And so they also may require assistive technology in order to communicate their needs. And so our teachers really work hard, and some of them, again, are not the content experts, but they work with their colleagues. And this is the first time this has really happened in our state. And I think as we move forward, if this is something that we continue, can be a model not only for our state, but for other states in the nation. This is typically not heard of working alongside our content experts, so we're very appreciative again. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we followed the same process that our colleagues did in the standard course of study. We had grades K2, 3, 5, middle school, high school biology, and high school earth and environmental science. So it's not all of the high school that are required, but only the key ones. Next slide, please. And again, our actions and our next steps are to continue following the process and work closely with our K-12 colleagues. We also have our survey out to our stakeholders that we've shared about 2 weeks ago when they disseminated their survey. We also disseminated ours to all of our stakeholders, including our Council for Exceptional Children. We'll continue to share the draft with our stakeholders, and we'll review that information, collect the feedback, and move forward to the next step.
Okay, moving into Healthful Living alongside science, and just as importantly, we have Healthful Living updates. We closed all PSU and all stakeholder surveys and applications. We finalized both teams, DRC and SWT, and data has been given back to us by OLR, so we're able to move forward with conducting the DRC orientation work session, which will take place in mid-December. And they will follow the same process science did with their report and recommendations, and then we will move forward with planning the SWT orientation and work session. The next several slides show you the broad strokes of those teams. So for physical education, the data review committee, these are the applicants. We received 12 applicants from across, as you can see in the map, those regions. From there, on the next slide, you'll see the DRC members. So from those 12, 10 were selected to serve on this committee. So you'll see the regional view and some demographics there. For health education, because within Healthful Living we have the two content areas, health education, we received 24 DRC applications. And from those 24, on the next slide, you'll see that 13 DRC members were chosen for health education. So that wraps up DRC. Now, when we look at the SWT, the standards writing team, for physical education, we had 27 applicants from across most of the regions. And from there, we chose 15 physical education members for the standards writing team. And again, this was a blinded process, and we asked members from other offices across the agency to help with this selection process. For health education applications, we had 33 applications from across the state. And then after the process of selecting, we have 15 SWT members from across most of the regions in the state. So that gives a high-level overview of what those teams will consist of.
Thank you to all of our presenters, and if I could just take a moment to point out that once again, we see the commitment that our teachers have for the learning of our students. 60 different educators gave an incredible amount of their time to make sure that students were getting what they needed in their science coursework. So I just thank you to all of you for that work. Are there any questions for any of our presenters? Superintendent.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kamens. My question is for is your last name Crocker or Crockett? Crockett? Thank you. First of all, I echo Ms. Kamens' sentiments. It's incredibly gratifying to hear about just the commitment, not just of time, but it sounds like heart and soul as well, that you and your colleagues put into this work. I just am so grateful that this was not just something that people went through the motions on, that there was so much depth and breadth and thought that went into this work. I have a question that really involves you sharing your opinion in general. For decades, the United States has been criticized for having, in general, education standards, which of course vary from state to state, but look very similar amongst each other, when compared to each other, that are a mile wide and an inch deep. Do you feel that we are still, with this process that you've just been through, are we still there, or do you see that there's some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of giving our teachers standards that they can go deeper with?
I think that's a valid question, and I think we're moving closer towards the greater depth that we really aspire to see happening in classroom instruction. Including those science and engineering practices, I think, is a really important step for us moving beyond just teaching science as a content area towards teaching science as a discipline and practice. I think the feedback from the stakeholder survey, which suggested that in general the content that we're teaching is appropriate, was an indication that the standards that we've been working on since 2009 were rather appropriate in breadth and depth. And now we're taking a very important step to move forward to see how we can embed those skills within teaching that content. And I think that'll help us create a much more competitive workforce, since students not just will understand the material, atoms and organisms and tectonic plates, but understand how to apply those scientific concepts in their life as a member of society and in whatever occupation they move into.
Well, thank you very much for your response and for all of your work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I finish that question?
Yeah.
I'll just add that from the data side of things, we did see some stakeholder feedback related to that point, and it was more about there's some redundancies. This has been done 2 or 3, 4 times at the same depth. So we took action on that. We made recommendations to consolidate some some objectives so that there was less redundancy, specifically between grade levels that were very close, like 8th and 9th grade. And the standards writing teams took that, and you saw the objectives decrease in number. I think that indicates that action was taken not only by the data team, but by the standards writing team as well. So we did try to, we attempted to make our stakeholders see that not only in number of standards, but also the way they're written, they're consolidated so that they can go deeper into the topics they're supposed to be discussing and building skills around.
Well, maybe the two of you can be a guide for future standards revision process, because what you've accomplished is incredible. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Hockenbach.
Yeah, thank you very much. I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation. My background is not science, it's another content area, but I'm fascinated with the information, the processes that you have gone through to get where we are today. I would think, to your question, Superintendent, I'm thinking about that 8th grade objective, and then all the pieces that build from that. That's about as deep as I can imagine, because the students are not just, they're writing, they're constructing an argument, they're doing some drawing. That is, I'm just amazed. The terminology, there's vocabulary, very challenging vocabulary there. I just think, what a classroom would be like a science lesson around that one particular objective. It's just, it's as rich as it gets. My question, though, is this. In your conversations with the stakeholders, with the teams and teachers and so on and so forth, did the issue about readability of the material ever surface as a concern? Because I'm just going back to that 8th grade objective in those terms.
Good morning. Yes, ma'am. Actually, one of the reasons we chose that particular example on the slide from the qualitative data was the nearly equal number of people that were suggesting they were or were not readable. That was something that we really tried to address. We also had a lot of feedback that once the standards and objectives are finalized by the board, the work that will go into the supporting documents, we're going to try to get away from this phrase unpacking, because that kind of can mean a lot of things. So we're working on thinking about all the supporting documents that need to come to bear. And the feedback did talk about, whatever you end up with, really it's the other training and support materials that come along really need to be aligned. And that is something that our team's already talking about moving forward, looking at an 18 to 24 month kind of plan, even prior to the board's final vote in June and July. So yes, ma'am, it did, although I would like each of our representatives to elaborate a little bit more from their work.
To answer your question, I feel like the inclusion of that explicit science and engineering practices clarifies what they're doing with the content. And so to talk about the clarity there, instead of just saying explain or infer, we're giving them actionable items to do with the content as the students are learning. Either that's how they're learning it or that's how they're demonstrating mastery of the concepts and skills. So to that point, I think that it does clarify some more. The readability piece is something that all the districts work through anyhow. They unpack the standards, right? They say, what does this mean? What does it look like? What does it sound like? And so that actually gives them very clear expectations of what they're doing with the standard, I feel. And some of that will come out in our first round of feedback, because this is the first draft that actually includes these. So I think that we're going to get some really rich feedback around that very point.
Thank you.
I think that was an excellent question, because that did come up many times in our conversations on the standard writing team. Because we were working at the same time with our colleagues from the EC department, we had a lot of conversations around what should every student be expected to do. What high standards can we hold every student across the state, regardless of what district they're coming from or what background they have. I think these standards are rigorous standards. And one thing, going back to what Dr. Aiken said about the supporting documents, is that those supporting documents hopefully will do a good job explaining to teachers what the boundaries are for the standard. To show them, if I'm teaching 8th grade, at what point do I stop with the depth of content for most students and focus on just that particular nugget of knowledge or that one accessible skill at a time.
Best wishes.
Thank you.
Seeing no more questions, and we always enjoy having the people who are actually doing the work in front of us to hear about what they're doing, and also oftentimes there are a lot more questions to you all than there are to those of us who sit up here in Raleigh. So thank you for that. And I just have to add that in committee we did talk about how useful this internal procedures manual is proving as we go through these standard provisions. I mean, it's really helpful to staff, and I'm sure to the two teams that we're working on it. So thank you for that. All right. The next item of new business is a digital teaching and learning progress update. And for that, I believe I'm turning to Dr. Dietrich.
Good morning, board members. Thank you for having us this morning.
Good morning.
Morning. We are glad to be here to give you an update on our digital learning plan from the state rubric. If you remember, if we go to the next slide, please. If you remember, we brought this framework to you in August, and at the center of this framework is that student learning experience, and then those 6 pieces that go around. It looks almost, looks like a Trivial Pursuit pie is what we used to call it growing up when I was playing that game. Please remember that as we work through our presentation today, that one of the things that we stressed back then is that this is a growth model. Part of doing a new plan is that you change those goalposts, you move the goalposts so that you have something new to achieve and something to move forward towards. So with that, in August, we had And again, if you remember, you have the state level rubric that we will report to you every year on. The PSUs have a rubric that they have to report on every other year, beginning this June. And then the schools have a rubric as well. With that, we had an internal process where we had all of DTL look at this, the connectivity department, and the Rethink group also look at this rubric at the state level to determine where we sit as we move towards our progression in this rubric. Next slide, please. Also, if you remember, we have 4 ratings. We have developing, proficient, accomplished, and distinguished. As we move through, we wanted to try to get this to be something that they're familiar with, they're used to seeing, so we tried to mirror that evaluation system. Next slide. And in our first one, leadership and vision, these 2 are developing, but there is a good reason for being developing on this. Actually, one of the goals that we have to do is present it to the state board. So we hope to move to proficient here shortly after we are done today. As well as we're going across the state with our new mission and vision that we have to make sure that we are making sure that everyone understands our goal and our purpose when we work with them. Next slide. In this one, we were proficient in the top and developing on the bottom 2. And what we're doing this year in order to try to help move our ratings to proficient is we're trying to align resources with the current digital learning plan. We're also putting in place coaching cohorts to help people integrate technology in their classrooms and actually have those coaches go into classrooms and assist people with doing this embedding of technology properly for that positive student experience. Next slide. For curriculum, instruction, and assessment, and please remember, when we look at this from our perspective, this is really a customer service plan for us at the state level. What are we providing, what are we doing, and how well are we doing it? On those first 2, we did proficient. And we have, since we've been tracking, and since July, we've done over 300 staff development resource opportunities to educate folks on the new digital learning plan and how they could best use it in their classroom. And the one we are developing in is the 3rd one about demonstrate mastery of the digital learning competencies and blended and personalized learning. We feel that there's always more that we could do there, and we're taking steps to increase resources in that area. Next slide. With the data privacy and cybersecurity, we ranked ourselves proficient in 1 and 3 and developing in 2. And really, this is all about increasing awareness, making sure the PSUs have the resources and everything to maintain student security and safety there. Next slide. Technology, infrastructure, and devices, we ranked ourselves developing on the 1 and 3, and we were proficient on 2. And here what we're doing is trying to create personalized PSU learning reports with data and also start to collect data on off-campus internet data so that we can help students get what the connectivity that they need all hours of the day so that they can do their work. And then lastly, this is our new mission that we all wrote together, that our Office of Digital Teaching and Learning will empower public school units through collaboration, support, innovation, and problem solving to enhance the learning opportunities with instructional technology for the North Carolina pre-K 13 community. And then our vision, if you go to the next one, every student in North Carolina will have a positive educational experience to ensure they're equipped to be lifelong learners. Because really one of the best things about digital teaching and learning that I've always really loved back to the days when I was teaching social studies in a classroom was it's about teaching students to become their own researchers, to go out and do all those things necessary and using these tools at their hands to become more efficient learners. So this is our progress on our state rubric. We hope you found it informative, and we look forward to coming back next year to show you how we've improved with all these initiatives that we've put in place this year. Do you have any questions for us?
Any questions for Dr. Booth?
Thank you.
It's a great amount of progress in a short period of time, and I'm sure there'll be leaps and bounds next year.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Finally, one more item of new business, North Carolina School Performance Grades Redesign. Dr. Moore, both of you.
Yeah, we're gonna tag team this event, this presentation. So, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, thanks for having us here today. We are excited to bring you an update about the school performance grade redesign work. So, if you'll remember, I think I mentioned to the board back in either August or early September that we were about to embark on this process with really an expedited timeline to bring recommendations before the start of the legislative long session to look at redesigning our accountability system for North Carolina, and particularly the school performance grades. So we're going to give you kind of a brief overview of the work that's happened, and then we'll take any questions towards the end. And I know we're a little bit behind schedule, so I'll be quick through these. So just to remind you, this is work that began early in Superintendent Truitt's tenure as part of Operation Polaris. So it was one of the 4 key areas, and it was accountability and testing. An early part of that work, of course, was the Porch of the Graduate, which we unveiled earlier this fall. The idea was that this work actually would have been kind of simultaneous to the Porch of the Graduate work, but we weren't able to do that. And then with some transition in the agency with deputies, we didn't get a chance to finish or engage in that work early, which is why we started it in September. So Operation Polaris, so we're ready to move. This is part of kind of, as I mentioned, the broader kind of set of goals around testing and accountability. And so this is to bring this multi-measure model. We can go to the next one. So the idea here is that, the pandemic really shed light on some of the shortcomings of our existing model. It was built more than 12 years ago. We've often talked about this work for a lot of states becomes generational, and that's a real issue for us when you think about what we've seen in light of the pandemic. So the model that we currently exist doesn't really work for us anymore. This kind of work that we're engaging in now also offers us an opportunity to reduce our reliance on test scores and think about adding valuable school quality indicators. We know that the measure of a school is more than just test scores. There's a whole lot that goes into that, and so we want to be able to bring those factors into play. And that includes things like school climate and some of the Porch of the Graduate work that we've just done, school safety, parent engagement, and career and college readiness. We are, with this work in mind, we are also balancing federal requirements. And so what you will not see today are the things that are already required by federal law. So, for example, we're not going to have a discussion around proficiency rates because we have to include proficiency rates. We're going to talk about the things that could be added on to our model to make it much more robust. Okay, and Dr. Smith will take over here for a bit.
All right. Good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that we're using to get to that end goal, as Dr. Marr mentioned, in January of bringing a recommendation to the General Assembly. Here you can see an overall timeline for our work using a research design implementation process. It's a high-level overview of some of the things that Dr. Marr just mentioned. Obviously, starting with Operation Polaris in September of 2021, there was a lot of research into what this model could look like, including doing kind of a cross-analysis of other state models across the United States to see what others are doing. We are kind of in the design phase right now. Here you can see between September and today, we've been really looking at the model, looking at our long list of indicators and engaging stakeholders, and that includes you today as well. Again, our end process here is that we bring this recommendation to the General Assembly in January, early February, and depending on what that recommendation looks like, we're proposing that we would pilot this in 2023 to 2024. As you might imagine, depending on which of those indicators we select, we may need to create some data systems that sit behind that, and we need time to be able to pilot that out in the field. Next slide, please. As you might imagine, this work cannot just happen with just a few folks inside DPI. This needs to be a large group process. And here you can see our advisory group members. We convene these representative groups and individuals to help us bring their individual expertise into the room to design the model. So the advisory group is made of representatives from across the state from various sectors. This includes our very own State Board of Education member, Jill Camnitz, as well as legislators, superintendents, district leaders with expertise in accountability, charter leaders, our very own teacher and principal of the year, and members from higher education, industry and workforce, as well as educational nonprofits. Within DPI, we also, at the bottom there, you can see a list of kind of content experts. And these are the folks who will take this in the next few months and really vet and look at the indicators to understand how we might implement them, thinking through things like reliability and validity of the model. Next slide, please. So as you might imagine, there's been a flurry of work over the past few months. And so I want to provide a kind of a window into some of the work that's been happening, not only with the advisory group, but also internally. So here you can see, this is a few pictures from our September meeting with our advisory group. That was the kickoff. And during this time, we invited in experts from the Center for Assessment to talk with us about our ESSA requirements, as well as other state accountability systems. So we spent quite a bit of time reviewing what other models there are across the country. We then dove into a conversation around what are our values and priorities around education in North Carolina. This question of what does a high-quality school look like in North Carolina? And if we answer that question, we can then try and determine how do we measure that, right? Different than just a standardized test once a year. So this group began to brainstorm the long list, as we affectionately call it. It's about 24 indicators, things that indicate high-quality schools in North Carolina. Some of those can be measured. Some of those are very difficult to measure at the same time. But nonetheless, we said put it all on the table, anything that indicates high-quality schools. So from that point, we then said, we'll go to the next slide, it can't just be this room of advisors, right? We need to get this out across the state. And so we worked with Ed&C to develop a survey. The survey included questions about the current model, the 80-20 model, as well as ways we might tweak that model, and all of the indicators, the 24 indicators or so that we were looking at. We saw a huge response from across the state. You can see a heat map there from the state, but we had results from the mountains to the coast. And what we found was that folks disagreed with the current model, that it did not indicate high-quality school measures, that it needed to be more extensive. We also coded close to 5,000 comments as well to make sure, asking a specific question, did we miss anything? We've given you all these indicators. Are there any other indicators that might show school quality? From that, we brought that back to our advisory group, the results of that, and we looked at the trends and discussed those with the group. Now, as you might imagine, that's a lot to digest, and so we actually sent that group home with some homework to talk with their affinity groups using a conversation guide that we developed that had that data and asked them to go back and say, if you're a superintendent, talk to other superintendents. If you're a teacher, talk to other teachers. If you're in higher ed, talk to other folks in higher ed to help influence your thinking around what should be included in our model. During that time, we began to cull down the list. We obviously can't have 24 indicators in our model. We need to cull down that list, looking at what's feasible, what's reliable, what's valid, and what really represents our educational priorities in North Carolina. And so we came back together in November to look at that and begin to cull that list down to 10 to 12. And what we're going to show you today are those indicators. Those indicators are grouped around academics and also school quality. And so we'll have a window in that in just a few moments. Next slide, please. Again, we know that we can't do this just in this building. We have to get this out to everyone. And so we've engaged in what I think is a rather robust stakeholder engagement process. We are out across the state meeting with superintendents, charter leaders, principals. You can see a short list of some of the folks we are talking to. The list is actually much longer than this. But we want to make sure that as we start to cull the list down into fewer and fewer indicators, that we have folks who are being impacted by the school performance grades, that the model might impact in the future, influencing our decision-making process. And so just to mention a few, this is a picture from AIM where we had all the CAOs from across the state together to provide input on the model. We also held office hours at AIM where teachers and anyone at the conference could come just talk to Dr. Marr and myself about their thoughts around our process. We're also crisscrossing the state over the next few weeks, talking to all the RESAs and their superintendents to ensure that we're hearing their feedback as well. With that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Marr to talk about how we're looking at the indicators.
And I think it's important to note, we're calling these engagement sessions because we're not actually going and talking at people. They're actually built so that we're providing them what we have heard from the field. And I think that's another note I want to make is this wasn't a list derived by DPI. The list actually evolved out of the feedback we did on the survey, whether it was the qualitative components or indicators that are used in other states or indicators that we currently use. So this was really this kind of organic process that we've engaged in to build out this list of quality indicators. So some of the things that we've heard thus far that we think are pretty kind of solid for the model at this point. But across all of the groups that we've talked to, there is broad consensus that we need separate models by grade band. We need a model for elementary, a grade for elementary, middle, and then high schools. Because what happens at each of those levels, it's different. And the kinds of indicators that we could put in place vary by that context as well. There has also been broad consensus that individuals would like some choice in the model. Now, one of the things we've learned from some other states is you can't have a system that has an abundance of choice, because that then puts far too much subjectivity into the model. However, we can, in a way that is both valid and reliable, provide some options to districts inside of this model, where we've got a model that has required indicators that stand for every school across the state, and then built into that framework, because we are going to weight these factors, you can have some choice. The choice piece actually also allows us to do some testing. So, for example, if we had a particular indicator, say something like a survey, if we did it on a smaller scale, we could actually test that out, build out the data system we need to learn whether or not we could deploy that statewide at a later date. So these are the kinds of things that we've really been grappling with, is this idea of maintaining some rigor, maintaining some objectivity, but then also having a model that works for the variety of schools that we have in the state. So some of the academic indicators, and what you'll see here is we've characterized these as most agreements, meaning everybody we've talked to thinks that these things are important. I do want to note, just because something is listed here as highly agreeable, that doesn't mean it's going to end up in the model, right? Some of the things we're balancing against is this idea of the measure being valid, the measure being reliable, and the measure being within the locus of control of the school or district. If it is not something that a district can control, it is hard to hold them accountable for that. And so we are trying to balance that as well. We are also very keenly aware that some indicators could provide a perverse incentive. And we want to ensure that we're not injecting something like that into the model as well. So we've seen broad consensus that an extended high school graduation rate would be advisable, right? So currently, we are required to do 4-year cohort graduation rate for the federal government. So we will have a 4-year cohort, but there is some appetite to have a 5-year or perhaps 6-year graduation rate as part of the model. Advanced coursework in high schools. Schools should be getting credit for APIB, CCP, CTE, arts courses, all of the other things. We currently have a model that really, it's too bad Dr. Green's not here. He talks a lot about, he has 6 teachers that determine the grade for his high school. 6. And that should tell us something. When it's 10% of your staff are really kind of putting in the metric there, that's not a great measure of the value of that school. So we want to ensure that we are going beyond just those federally required tested courses. There is a lot of individuals are interested in this idea of improving student group performance. So I know for a long time we've talked a lot about closing gaps. And so this is another way of thinking about closing gaps. Rather than benchmarking against a reference group, let's actually dig into the work and say, let's look at our student groups and see how we are improving the performance of students by group in a school or in a district. And then, again, post-secondary pathways, a huge, important part of what we're doing in our schools now. So this idea of employed, enlisted, and enrolled. And actually, yesterday in our conversation with the testing and accountability group, one of the things that came up was this idea of employed is hard to measure. What about employability? And so thinking about a student's employability through credentialing or some other metric, so that every student who graduates from a North Carolina public school is able to pursue the post-secondary pathway of their choosing, and are we pushing them towards that future? And then some agreement around this idea of measuring innovative teaching and learning. Again, this is one of those that's really hard. It's hard to think about. How do you measure that? What do you mean? We've got to define it. But we want to give ourselves some flexibility in terms of we don't want to strike something out because it's hard to measure, right? We have a lot of good people who can help us think about that. And then again, access to opportunities that prepare students. Some of our school quality indicators. A lot of agreement around this idea of measuring durable skills. We just put a ton of work into the Portrait of Graduate. Again, hard to measure some of these durable skills, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. There are systems currently being developed. There are other states that are starting to develop some of these metrics around measuring durable skills. We certainly don't want to jettison something because we can't do it right today. That doesn't mean we can't do it 6 months from now or a year from now. Student attendance and absenteeism. This is one of those that gives a lot of people heartburn. Right? I think I was the School Board Association, and Mr. Hall was there, and I talked a lot about, right, if it gives you heartburn, this is one of those that's hard for us to think about. This is one that we're concerned about could provide perverse incentive, right? So if I am concerned about a metric that looks at attendance or absenteeism, and then, I think you see where I'm going. It kind of goes along with the idea of measuring discipline as well. If I set up a system where I am holding schools accountable for discipline practices, and then schools, essentially aren't disciplining students, have I done something that changes the safety or the feeling of safety inside of that school? So we're trying to balance those, and it is a delicate dance there. And then this idea of a teacher effectiveness profile. So what we don't want to do in the model, as was evidenced yesterday talking with testing and accountability directors, we can't just do a kind of teacher effectiveness rating using EVOS, because then we would have two measures inside of the model measuring the same thing. So we certainly don't want to do that, but is there an effectiveness profile that we can think about that's far more broad than just value-added growth? And then some agreement around this idea around school climate. And so that includes everything from safety and environment to school cleanliness. And cleanliness is another one of those that gives some people some heartburn. If I've got an old school, no matter what I do, it's hard to give it the perception that it's clean, right? So things that we're struggling with here. And then, of course, post-secondary preparation and extracurricular, intracurricular activities for students. Okay? You the next one or am I the next one? All right. So what are our next steps? So at this point, we are in the process of, as Andrew mentioned, he and I are traveling to all of the regions in the state, visiting all of the REISs and superintendents. I was at the School Board Association meeting recently. I think you were somewhere recently. Dr. Howard met with NC Papa. So it is not just, I think you see the two of us here, but there's actually a fantastic team here at DPI that has been doing this work, including Tammy Howard and Christy Van Auken, and then folks within our groups that are helping us. So it's a huge team effort here to get everybody out and across. But we're currently doing all these meetings to continue to cull that long list into a shorter set of actionable indicators. From that list, we'll be working internally with Dr. Howard's team to look at the validity and reliability of measures, whether or not we could do it. Is it, could this be part of a model? And then again, continued stakeholder engagement. We're going to bring another set of findings on December 12th to our advisory group, and then we expect sort of a final version, I think, in, would we say late January? In late January.
So we're close to the schedule or to the ending point for the SLA meeting, but our final two items will be very brief, and this is really important discussion. So if it's all right, I'm gonna take a little extra time to make sure, because this is our opportunity for feedback on this work. So Dr. Ford, start with you.
I still have to get used to that. I appreciate it. So first and foremost, amazing work. Thank you so much for explaining this in layman's terms in a way that is accessible. And 19,000 responses is massive. That's a massive level of engagement. So you are to be applauded for that. I have a couple of comments, and I will say kind of persuasive arguments I'll try to make, right? So just want to provide my own personal feedback. As you're culling the list going from long to short, definitely the improving student group performance and growth, obviously something with a measure. I'm curious about the analysis, and I appreciate what you said. Really going to focus more on gap convergence from group to desired standard rather
Yes.
than intergroup, right? Because other groups like not the standard, right? It's about how we're all making progress toward the desired goal. But then even more on slide 13, I see there's some agreements around school climate. And I want to make the argument to really push that one ahead. Reason being, and I would say with the caveat that I would include culture as a part of the school climate survey. When you start talking about those subgroups, there are these hidden data, or what authors LaSalle and Johnson call the wallpaper effect, where it may look good on the veneer on the outside, and you start peeling back the layers, and there are all sorts of pieces. Students don't feel comfortable. They don't feel like their culture's off front. They feel like it's an inherently oppressive environment. You just won't be able to determine that unless you measure those things. And so in the interest of pushing forward equity and making sure that's at the basis, I definitely want to make a strong argument for that being, for one, school climate in general, because it's so important, right? You've shown me a school that's prospering. I can pretty much predict what the climate of that school is like, from leadership all the way down to the students. But then also including culture as a specific measure of one of those indicators. So I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, well, yeah. So we're taking notes. One of the challenges I've mentioned earlier, right, is this: we are very interested in school culture, school climate. How do we measure it? It's likely a survey. There are lots of challenges with surveys, which is why we also want to have the opportunity to kind of pilot some of this work and build out an infrastructure that allows us to do this in a valid. I mean, we have an example in the teacher working conditions survey, so we know we could deploy surveys, right, large scale. But it's a little different when you're surveying parents and students, so we got to be a little more mindful. But yes, thank you for the. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Thank you. And to add to what Dr. Ford said, it's not just the students who need to feel that their school is a place where they belong. Our teachers need to feel that this is a place where they belong and are valued in whatever way they're contributing to their school. And students' parents need to feel that this is a safe place for them.
Yes.
Too often, especially as students get older, well, not all. I mean, my experience is with high school, but I know this is true with elementary and middle schools as well. If a parent didn't have a good experience in school, they're not going to want to be a part of that school culture and climate. So sometimes, if a principal doesn't deliberately make an attempt to make it a place where all parents feel that they have a voice at that school, then there can be that parents won't feel welcome at school.
Yeah, we fully agree.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I certainly agree with Dr. Ford's and Madam Superintendent's comments concerning the parent role. That's why I was so interested in the 19,000 comments and the EDC work. And I want to make sure in my mind that we're doing all that we can to get input. I'm assuming some of those 19,000 were parents. I want to make sure
a little
that.
more than half.
I'm sorry.
It was about 45% of the respondents were parents.
Great. But also, when we talk, I want to commend you on your presentation at the school board conference. We heard, I heard many comments from board members concerning, finally, we are going to get another way of identifying schools who are successful. Blah, 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 blah. Not in those terms, but there were many, many board members who were glad to hear that.
Right.
And I commend you on that, and your department, Madam Superintendent. But I just want to make sure that everyone is involved in this process. You heard the lady from Florida. She sort of confused me. I mean, I didn't know where she was going with that presentation. But
Oh, the Dr. Hovnanitz? I think that's how you pronounce it.
well, anyway.
Yes. Dr. Howard and I, we had actually had a separate conversation with her,
Well, great.
separate meeting with her.
That's
Yes.
great to hear.
Yes.
But I just want to say that, I'm so excited about the work, and hopefully we will see the end product, a better way of identifying schools. But let's make sure that the local commerce folk are involved and know about it. The Rotary Club know about it, and that Rotary Club now can be quite effective in moving things forward. These organizations, and I'm going to say again, hopefully that 19,000 included them.
Yep.
Is any of those people on the?
They're on the advisory committee as well, yes, sir. And I think part of our conversation with the School Board Association also talked about exactly what you're saying, this idea of being able to identify schools that are most in need of improvement. That I think our current model has I think what I heard at the School Board Association was we have a lot of districts that have schools designated as low performing and no one believes those schools are low performing at all.
Correct.
Right? They've never been on the low performing list. We have districts that have never had a low performing school and all of a sudden they have a bunch of them.
Yeah.
And that is an artifact of what we've been through the last couple of years. We need a process that helps us to better identify those chronically or persistently underperforming schools so that we can provide the kind of support that we can deliver. We can't deliver support to 700 schools in North Carolina, but we at DPI can certainly deliver support to a smaller number that really need that support.
And also what it says to me is that we are responding to a concern. And there's no doubt about it. If parents don't have a good feel for that school when he or she was there, or that district, we're not going to be successful in what we're trying to do. I would give an example. I'm not going to hold time, but I had a recent, before I came here to the meeting yesterday morning, I had a examination to make sure I was fit to be here. But the lady who was in the room with me, the physician assistant, was a graduate of my local high school. And we started talking about that. But her experience now was different from what I thought she was going to come to. But I'll leave that alone. But to hear her talk to me, and she was putting that nozzle down my throat and all that kind of stuff, I was wondering now, are you doing it right or are you going to become? But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to add to the comments about how important it is and what a well-done job it appears as we have in progress to get a lot of input from a lot of different constituencies on this in terms of trying to get the full scope of what the considerations ought to be. So two comments out of that. One of them is this is a statewide effort. You appear to have worked very hard to get statewide input and have statewide people in the advisory group that you're working with. One of the most important things we can do right now is uplift the position of educator. And in fact, I think it's critical if we're going to have outstanding high-quality educators, which we talk a lot about, we'll talk a lot about today. This is an opportunity to work through that theme, and we should take every opportunity. So I just suggest to you that that's something that be part of the work of the group as you're working through this accountability work. And the second one is, and you touched upon this briefly, and I think you referred to it as a delicate issue. On the high considerations for student absenteeism, it would be pretty hard to disagree with that. If a student's not there, they're not going to learn, and so it clearly has an effect in terms of the school, in terms of the quality of the education that's being provided. But there was less interest in trying to bring in a component that relates to discipline in the schools, and I think I appreciate your comment about it's difficult. I think the only way that you can meaningfully get at this over time is the data is pretty clear. There's a disparity in discipline. Students of color are disciplined disparately from students who are white, and that's been true nationally. It's been true in our state, and there's been data to support that now at this point going on at least 2 decades. Pretty thorough data. And so if we don't build that into the component in some way, when we all readily acknowledge it's very high priority, it's important that the child be there in school. If the child's suspended for 10 days or for longer, they're not in school. And there may be good reasons for that. That's the delicate posture that you refer to. But
we have a way that we are trying to kind of thread this needle. So what we've talked about is we are actually going to bring a different model for the school report card itself. So this whole process is going to lead to a different report card. And one of the things we're looking at is making the report card more interactive so that it's not a static document, but rather more of like a tableau where I could actually look across a number of factors. But the report card will include both items that are part of the school performance grade and items that are measured but don't necessarily factor into the grade. And so we absolutely see things like absenteeism or suspension data as part of the report card, but because of all these other challenges we may have, we may not be able to include them in the calculation of the grade, if that makes sense.
It may make sense, it depends how you thread that
Yeah.
needle.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
not going to on the front end. I mean, it's a topic that's of significant interest, and the point is that the data will show that two students commit the exact same offense under the code of conduct for that district. One's a student of color, one's a white student. And the discipline or punishment handed out is disparate on a measure of 2 to 3 times for the student of color over the student who is white. And there's a lot of data that suggests that's gone on for a long time. And it's complex. To Dr. Ford's, I got to get Dr. Ford in my head. Dr. Ford's point, the culture is important with that too, because the immediate assumption is, well, that's white principals doing that, and the answer to that is not necessarily.
Yep.
The culture is far more complex than that, and so yes, it's hard, and yes, it's nuanced, but it's extremely important to the education or lack thereof that some of our children are receiving by either being there or not being there. So I appreciate the work that goes into that aspect of this difficult issue. I don't think you can talk about absenteeism as a high-level item and discard disciplinary.
I agree. Yeah, we agree.
You just can't do that.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Oxendine, and then.
Yes, thank you very much, and this has been a very good presentation. And to Vice Chair's point, I think discipline and attendance have a subtle way of affecting other indicators. Morale, teacher morale, student morale, all that culture means. It means many things, very, very much associated with the climate. So it's almost like you can't separate these pieces because they do feed upon each other. So I admire you. I mean, the innovation behind this is incredible, and I admire the fact that you're thinking of other ways to get at it. But it's there. Teachers can be all day long very frustrated because this child hasn't been in school 10 days in a row, behind on homework, on and on and on. You know the story, right? The other question that I have relates to, you mentioned several times about working or talking, collaborating with other states who are doing this. Could you bring some of that data, what you're learning from other states?
So, do we have it on the website? Did we do Yeah, the very first presentation we did with the group from the National Assessment Center actually brought a kind of a 50-state analysis, which I think is on our website. So we have actually tracked all of this work online. If you go to the DPI website, I think it's housed under the Office of Learning Recovery, and you'll see school performance grade redesign, and all of the presentations are there.
I think it's linked, Michael, in the board materials.
Okay.
What other states are doing?
Yeah, well, it'll be the presentations will be in there. Yes.
All right, good.
Yep.
Yes. All right.
And and to be honest, we're trying to lead in this work. So I can appreciate what other states are doing, but they're not North Carolina. And I would much prefer for us to look at what's happening in another state, and we've done that, but really to forge a path that's right for us. Let's pull the good pieces from what we see elsewhere, and help that to inform our work.
We don't want to step in minefields.
That's right. That's right.
All right, well, we all know how to get in touch with Dr. Smith and Dr. Marr, so if you think of
Yes.
something that you'd like to add, please feel free. I just have to say really quickly, because I know we need to move on, but this group of people who make up this advisory committee have been incredibly dedicated to the work and very deeply
Yes.
involved, and it's been a big time ask for a lot of busy people.
Yeah.
So it's also really sort of inspiring that they want to help us this much, the folks that aren't even inside the education community. So the value that they put on this.
Can I ask one very quick question? Very quick.
Okay.
What is the timing of when a recommendation is expected from this group to come to the board?
That's a good question. I'll have to talk to Dr. Petrie Martin about getting it to you.
Well, are you going to be ready in January with something, or more likely in February?
It'll probably be February.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much.
Yeah. We have a lot to do between now and then. So we want to make sure we've got it right before we bring it.
Well, we understand.
Okay. All right.
So, Dr. Marr, stay put.
Yes, ma'am.
Because we're going
Oh, because I have the next item as well.
Yeah.
Let me get my.
An action item we heard quite a bit about last month was SLA1, which is a report to the General Assembly on broadening successful participation in advanced courses. It's just a data-rich report. Nothing has changed from last month, so if there are any questions, Dr. Marr can answer them, but otherwise we'll just move on.
Yep. And Ms. Shaw Coltrane had just a couple of notes for me just to highlight for folks, if that's okay. So overall, North Carolina continues to make gains with access and success for advanced courses, AP, IB, and Cambridge. Several of North Carolina's data outpaces the country. The number of AP exams earning a score of 3 or better increased 13.3%. One demographic student group realized increases in both access and successful participation. Black AP exam takers increased 1.2% from 2021 to 2022. Black students' exams attaining a 3 or greater score increased 36.7% over the last year, as compared to a 35% for the same group nationwide. And the number of Hispanic student exams with 3 or greater increased 24.7% over last year, outperforming 24% increase for the same group nationwide. Still a lot of work to do, but we are certainly making progress in North Carolina.
Thank you for that. I should have said this is a very positive report and shows a great progress. So thank you for that. Finally, we have one consent item, which is SLA2. It's a report to the General Assembly on the implementation of the arts education graduation requirement. You all may recall that beginning with this year's 6th graders, an arts education credit is required for graduation in North Carolina. And this report basically outlines the work that is being done at the department to support this requirement in our schools across the state. So, and that concludes the SLA meeting. My apologies for going over, but we had a lot of moving stuff.
Thank you, Ms. Kamnitz. We'll now move to the discussion of education, innovation, and charter schools, chaired by Ms. Amy White. Ms. White.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the December meeting. I'm Amy White. I'm the chair of the Education, Innovation, and Charter School Committee, along with Ms. Jill Kamnitz. We are super excited to have Rowan Salisbury, the state's only renewal school district, before us today to give an annual update on the good work that they're doing in the western portion of the state. And so, Dr. Smith, I believe you're going to introduce our very important guest. Thank you so much for making the trip today. And you missed our committee meeting call. The PowerPoint is amazing. So excited.
All right. Well, good morning, Chair Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, Superintendent Truitt, members of the board, and those of us joining us in person and virtually. I'm excited to introduce the annual report for the state's first and only renewal school system as established in 2018 as part of House Bill 986. House Bill 986 established the criteria for one district in North Carolina to apply for a new designation as the renewal school system, which provides charter-like flexibilities across the district and its schools. As part of the legislation, an annual report is due to DPI on several metrics. Today we'll hear from Rowan Salisbury School's leadership on those metrics and an update on the progress in implementing those flexibilities. Here to present the renewal school system annual update is the district's new superintendent, Dr. Kelly Withers. Dr. Withers is no stranger to Rowan Salisbury, innovation, or the renewal flexibilities. During her tenure in Rowan Salisbury, she served as a teacher, an assistant principal, a high school principal at 2 different high schools, and the chief schools officer, and is now the new superintendent. During her time, she was able to experience the power of those flexibilities both at the school and district level. With that, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Kelly Withers for the annual report.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. And good morning to all of you. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and as Dr. Smith said, I am Kelly Withers. I'm the new superintendent in Rowan Salisbury Schools, but I do think it's important, as he noted, to know that although I've only been in the district for 60 days as the superintendent, I spent 21 years in the district before leaving in December and then returning again in September as the new superintendent. So the work that I'm going to share with you today, I'm deeply invested in and extremely excited about the future of it. And so I'll jump right in so that we honor your time and share a few updates with you. So we can move to the next slide. We're going to go go ahead and go over an overview of Rowan Salisbury schools. We do have approximately 18,000 students. As of last week, we had 18,753, which we are excited about because that is an increase. We are seeing an increase in our enrollment, which is exciting for us. We have 33 schools. We do receive low wealth funding. We're about 64% free and reduced lunch, socioeconomically disadvantaged at the current moment. Demographically, you can see 19% Black, 22% Hispanic, 50% white, 9% other races. We were the first large-scale K-12 Apple one-to-one program in North Carolina. We were not the first one-to-one program, but we were the first one to take it K-12 in 2014. So we've been doing that for quite a bit of time. And as Dr. Smith mentioned, we're the first and only renewal school district in North Carolina, as you are aware. I think the timeline is important for the context of our story. So June of 2018, House Bill 986 was signed into law. In August of 2018, the State Board approved that plan, and our teacher-led design teams got to work immediately. The real spirit of innovation behind the renewal law as we implemented it, that it was teacher-led and teacher-designed. So it took us an entire year to get even the schools that were the front runners, the ones that were ready for the innovation, to get started. Everyone started with a needs assessment, really deeply researching. We had groups that went to see schools all over the nation, both via Zoom and conference calls before we were tired of Zoom and conference calls, and having those conversations with schools about pieces and parts that were successfully being implemented. And so that work went throughout. In the spring of 2019, our early adopter schools started to present to our local board. April 1st, to be exact, was the first presentation, where schools were starting to try to make changes and shifts in their practices to impact students first and teacher retention and staff retention as well. So in August of 2019, our first schools really started to launch their plans, the groups that were going first, and they were at an all-time high in morale and momentum, and a lot of work had gone into that and their implementation. And then in March of 2020, as you know, we all went home. As a part of that work, though, we were already in the process of applying for grants and funding opportunities, and in September 2020, we were awarded the Teacher and School Leadership Grant, $26.3 million, to help with some of the work that we were planning to do. And we have done, I would say, a pretty good job of trying to maintain that momentum with that specific grant work. But as you know, we spent much of the 2020, 2021 years measuring distance of students apart, having lots of different conversations than what we were having just the year before. In December of 2020, our superintendent retired, and in January of 2021, we had a leadership transition. Dr. Tony Watlington was with you last year for this presentation, and he spent much of the 21-2022 year designing a renewal 2027 strategic plan. In April of 2022, Dr. Watlington left Rowan Salisbury Schools. So we had a leadership transition and an interim was appointed. In July of 2022, that interim went to Mooresville graded. And then in September, so we appointed another interim. And in September of 2022, I started on September 26, 2022. So it is important to the context that since December of 2020, Rowan Salisbury has had 5 superintendents. So that direction and that journey has been a bit of a confusion, a bit of a source of confusion for our staff. But we are continuing to work through that, and I'm excited to be back. As I said, and as Dr. Smith said, I spent the first 21 years of my career there. My children are currently in school there. My family lives there, so I'm deeply invested in this work. So since then, I have visited every school. We have been in all 6 of our communities gathering feedback with the objective of stabilizing, unifying, building our team. We had 10 district-level vacancies when I arrived, and so we are building that team to try to accelerate that work with our timeline of being a relaunch in January of really pushing this forward. Next slide, please. So as you know, there are multiple buckets of our flexibilities. I'm going to hit very high level. We do have curriculum flexibilities. Our teacher-led design team spent a lot of work designing around curriculum and meeting the needs of our students during that initial design year. It was great to listen to the presentation this morning of science standards and hearing that conversation around standards. We were able to reduce the North Carolina final exams, but we still take EOCs, EOGs, ACT, all of those marks, which you'll see in just a second. But a great example of our work around fundamental standards that I wanted to try to provide some real in the field, what does this work look like, is high schools spend a lot of time looking at standards and deciding, we didn't eliminate standards, but we said, what do we really need to emphasize, not just for a test, but for the life and future pathway of each kid. And that can be different. If you're looking at a Math 3 curriculum, there are standards in there that may not always apply to every kid that is their next pathway and steps. And a result of that work came out of high school teachers looking and saying, you teach that, I teach that. So, for example, if you're talking about population growth and exponential growth and what that looks like on a graph in math, we can talk about in biology as well. It came out of that some integrated coursework. 2 examples. In math, we offer Amped Up Algebra. It's a national model course where we tie Math 1 to our carpentry classes, and students can go in there and learn real-life math and how it is applied. We also offer geometry and construction, Amped Up Algebra. Those 2 are tied together. Math 1 is actually tied to business and entrepreneurship. Math 2 is tied to our carpentry and curriculum. So that's an example of curriculum flexibilities and teachers saying, why aren't we doing this together? The next one is budget. We do have budget flexibilities. We get our state funds in one lump sum rather than in multiple restricted buckets, as we call them. We use our school-based renewal plans to document the budgetary flexibilities. That oversight comes both from the individual principals and teachers that are meeting and discussing it. Our schools team reviews it, which is the executive directors of each grade spans. Our chief of schools, or now it's called chief administrative officer, takes a look at that, and our finance department looks at it. So there's not a lack of oversight. It's just a lack of where that source initially comes from and how we get that there. And schools also have flexibility based upon performance. And that is some of the things that we've been working on, is how to define performance. Again, very much enjoyed the presentation on the multiple measures, because that is work that we really started looking at in 2018-19. The next flexibility is personnel. So we do have the opportunity to hire teachers with industry expertise in their areas of strength, regardless of a teaching license. And we do have currently in our district 156 teachers that are operating under a renewal license. And I gave you some example areas. Dance, there are multiple. Dance, strength and conditioning, photography. And that's not just at the high school level. That is across the board in K-12. How do we look at what students are passionate about and find teachers that are expertise and have expertise in that field, but may not have an active teaching license, and sometimes, in some cases, only come for 1 period a day or 1 hour a day to share their expertise and then go right back into the field where they are experts. And then the last one is our calendar flexibility. Opportunity to create a school calendar that meets the needs of our students, parents, community, and the design curriculum. One of the first things that we did was an early start calendar. We have not pushed calendar flexibility probably to the limits that we could, but it is definitely a piece that we are continuing to consider, both for our student needs as well as staff retention, which we'll talk about that in just a second. All right, so this was the directional system that was derived all the while we were doing this work. And so there's 3 equal parts: academic skills, interpersonal skills, and unique life goals. The most important part of any part of that image up there is that the center says the healthy and engaged learner. So we are tying everything back to what do our learners need. And I tell staff all the time, this isn't that we're spending 33% on academic skills, 33% on interpersonal. It's how we tie it together, and we make sure that what we are doing in our classroom meets the needs of all of these. You can see that there were 3 additional pieces added. You can also see them on some of the work that you guys have been presented this morning in human capital, in parent and community engagement, and then operational efficiency. And these are the areas or the buckets that we are trying to develop metrics of success for, and what that might look like above and beyond what a test score is. So current state, this is what we are required to present on. There are 6 measures here in the first part: graduation rate, dropout rate, CTE data, growth, proficiency, and low-performing schools. There are multiple challenges within this data. You can see graduation rate as you look there. 84.5 is that last mark for us. And graduation rate is something even pre-renewal was a focus for us in making sure that students graduate, ideally on a 4-year timeline, but also in a 5-year or even more if they need that to get them back. Although we don't always capture that in an accountability measure, our objective is that we do not lose any student along the way. Next, dropout rate. They somewhat go hand in hand. Those metrics are different, as you know. Our last dropout rate was 2.16. We have made significant progress. You can see that over the years that are displayed there. That has continued to be a different struggle. I wouldn't say a new struggle, but definitely the pandemic brought a different lens to that struggle of students who are entering and exiting school for varied reasons, employment being one of them as well. The next one is our CTE credentials, and the reason this number can be higher than 100%, if any of you are math people, sometimes that's hard to see, is because courses have more than one credential, and so you can see in the 3 years that we've measured this metric, we have had 131%, 152%, and then last year was 92%, meaning that our students that are in our CTE courses are working towards those industry credentials to be able to be used outside of school once they graduate. Our next one is our growth. It is definitely an area of struggle, this one and our proficiency areas. Just like everyone else, I think the pandemic had an impact. There were other impacted pieces. I mentioned at the beginning, we've had 5 superintendents in 2 years. Directionally, that poses a challenge for staff. That's just being completely honest and transparent. So you can see that in the impact of our results as that percentage of not meeting growth has increased over the last year. And then the proficiency sees that similar trend to the state where there was kind of a flat line and then a dip. A very, very slight increase. We were at 33.8. That is not something that we are satisfied with, but that is the current measure of our EOG and EOC scores. Next. You can see similar trends in our subgroups there. You can see that the RSS average is at 33.8 and our gaps definitely exist across groups. This is something that we've even been examining over the last few weeks since I've returned to look at this and to talk about if we're truly personalizing learning, then what is that looking like for our students and how are we measuring that in varied ways. And then our ACT composite, you can see that there as well. The last metric is 16.1. The state average is 18.2, I believe. And that is another metric that we are not satisfied with and will continue to work on as we continue to work through what multiple measures we use to deem our success. And then low-performing schools, we saw a similar spike in that number as the state did. We do have schools on that list that have never been on that list before. We have schools on that list that have been on that list before. And so we have work to do in that space as well. Teacher mobility rate and principal turnover are 2 additional metrics that we've been asked to report on. If you want to keep going, we'll talk about those. Our teacher mobility rate or teacher turnover, meaning teachers leaving us, is actually down, which is a good indicator for us. We watch that very closely. I do think our renewal status helps us in that quite a bit, both as a recruitment tool and as a retention tool. So we are proud of that number and continue to monitor that. Every week we report on what our teacher vacancies look like and how we are working to fill those. Our principal turnover has increased. You can see a dip. Again, you can parallel that with district leadership, but in lots of other pieces and parts. The pandemic did not help us in that space. People that could retire did retire, and we've also had directional changes and challenges, and we continue to work on that as well. And the last one is student attendance. You mentioned some of the challenges with this metric. We are required to present our data on it. If you will go forward, you will see that our attendance went down to 90.8. You can look at the 2019-20, which would have been pre-pandemic levels. We were seeing an increase, and of course we can't directly correlate that to all of the changes and experiences and work that we were doing in the school, but we would certainly like to think that that had an impact on engaging students, because that is exactly what we were trying to do by providing experiences outside of school, as well as drawing relevance into the classrooms. And then you can see our attendance has dropped over the last 2 years. Okay, so this came out of our committee that Dr. Watlington worked through. I think it is a quote that really summarizes our objective. Our community deserves a school system with an autonomy that empowers schools to create an engaged learning environment through a whole child approach. So students enjoy learning and teachers enjoy teaching. So that came out of the community group that was working through the strategic plan to say this is what our community deserves out of the work that you are doing. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of go into a little bit of those buckets and tell you what our current focus is. In academic skills, our focus is on finding an assessment that provides the current state for a student in order to develop a personalized roadmap for growth and proficiency. Meaning that we are looking at how do we know not just that a student isn't at the 4th grade level, but what level are they? So that we know then how to attack and bring them up to grade level and beyond and meet their personalized needs. Some of the celebrations we have in that area, we do have a competency-based pilot at elementary and high school. I know that we've had visits, obviously by the picture, to Morgan Elementary, to our elementary competency-based pilot. They have done tremendous work. I welcome any of you to visit and listen to the students talk about their progress, not in terms of I made a 90, but in terms of what level they are on and where they are trying to go. And also listening to them ring the bell when they get to that level. They're very proud of that work. We also have a high school. South Rand High School is doing some limited work in specific areas on competency-based. I happen to have 2 children that are in some of those classes, and it is interesting for them to tell me as well about the fact that they're not going to have a grade necessarily right now at their report card because they're still working. They're not yet ready to tell where they are in that level. And hearing 2 15-year-old girls articulate that, I do have twin 15-year-olds, hearing them articulate that does my heart good both as a parent but also as an educator. Interpersonal skills, we have a focus on the growth and development of the whole child through intentional lessons and experiences, as well as assessment tools and portfolios to illustrate that progress. As you would imagine, that's challenging. It's challenging to assess interpersonal growth, but we have been working through different tools and allowing students to self-assess, allowing teachers to assess and see where those gaps are and what the student might think of themselves versus what the teachers see, as well as having parents conversations. I had a conversation this week in a school about student-led conferencing and how they're able to articulate their growth in things like civility and work ethic and collaboration and having those conversations. Also, a point of celebration for us was the recent release of the North Carolina Portrait of a Graduate. To see those parallels and to see the state for our staff validate that work that they've been working on was a large victory for us. And they've already started talking about what those skills look like versus what we had identified and how do we make sure that we're matching that. And quite honestly, it matches very well. Next. Unique life goals. This is the area that our staff is the most passionate about. They can articulate it very well and have a conversation. So really focusing on the exploration of K-8 and experience. Exploration is K-8 and experience in 9-12. In students' productive passions. What are you passionate about and how can that tie to productivity as a citizen once you graduate? And so that they will be, you see the same 3 words, enrolled, enlisted, or employed upon graduation. And we did a lot of work around how do you measure that. We're not there yet, but we've certainly had some conversations. Dr. Smith can share some of those victories and some of those failures we've had along the way. But that's our goal. So a couple of celebrations there that are unique. We have a Rowan Education Collaborative in our county, which is a group of people. It is we serve on it as the leaders in the school district, but we also have our Catawba College partner there, Livingstone College partner is there, the chair and the vice chair of our county commission is there, the chair and the vice chair of our board is there, the president of Rowan Cabarrus Community College serves on it, and varied other members of those teams in an attempt to turn our community into an educationally focused community, and that conversation revolves around educational attainment. And it has been a very productive conversation, sparked out of the passion initially of renewal and bringing the whole community into that effort. And then student experiences, we have been very focused. I was in West Rowan High School last week, and a student interrupted the conversation between the principal and I because he had just returned from his job shadow, and he needed to tell the principal about it. And when he walked away, the principal said, that's what this is about. And that is what this work is about, is trying to pair students who may not have the opportunity to get into the field and have those experiences to see that, both for the piece of being able to say that is not what I want to do any longer, or that is something I'm incredibly passionate about. And then another one that I wanted to highlight is the promising practice that the state has named, which is our warehouse. The warehouse is an entrepreneurial opportunity inside of South Rowan High School. They run a store inside that school for clothing. It sounds very simple. If you haven't seen it, you should come visit that as well. It is totally, the entire facility was designed by our students. Our interior design students designed it. They have an inventory process. They have a point of sale process. They have interns that work in there each day to get internship opportunities. They're in charge of social media and marketing so that people know what products they have, community events to come in for students to be able to shop during the day. From a human capital perspective, we are focused on employee recruitment and retention, as is everyone. But some celebrations that we've had, these are primarily out of our Teachers School Leadership Grant. We did last year performance-based compensation portfolios where teachers were given criteria and they could submit a portfolio of work that shows evidence of them meeting those. An external group scored those, and then they were paid a stipend based on that external scoring. 3 of our high-need schools, due to retention supplements, were able to retain 100% of their first-year teachers, which was quite an accomplishment in the last year. 5 of our high-need schools retained 95% or greater of their veteran teachers, again, due to retention supplements that we were able to offer. And 8 out of our 10 apprentices at our Accelerate Rowan Lab School are full-time teachers. That lab school brings in pre-apprentice and apprentice teachers from Catawba College, offers stipends to them as a pre-apprentice and as an apprentice. It's $500 and then $2,000. So they're going to school and receiving that and getting on-the-job embedded training with master teachers who receive a stipend for the work as a master teacher as well. And 8 out of the 10 of those returned back to our district as full-time teachers. So moving forward, we are getting ready to relaunch Renewal 2027. We're going through a robust feedback process, although quick. To be quite honest, we've met with principals, assistant principals, teachers, community members, classified staff, our support staff, and next week I have the honor of meeting with students to be able to give us feedback on it as well. Our biggest challenge has been developing clear metrics of success, and I think that you have seen that both in our data but even in the conversation this morning. Some of these things are not easy to measure, and doing national conversations with experts around that. I met with a superintendent in Georgia yesterday to talk about some work that they've done in that area. Standard aligned student engagement is what we are super passionate about, not just standard aligned lessons, but making sure they're engaging for students. Expanding our work on budget flexibility specifically linked to student outcomes, so basing autonomy on what we're actually seeing as measures, and not just test scores, but multiple measures of work. And then expanding our support to support renewal teachers. It doesn't go unnoticed that if you don't have a teaching license and you haven't been in a high school or a middle school or an elementary school lately, it can be a little bit of a learning curve to learn what students are really like. So we just need to beef up our professional development and support of those renewals teachers so that they're prepared for working with those students. Okay, that was super quick, but I will take any questions that you might have.
Does anybody else just want to do a round of applause? You know, about sometimes when you're presenting, it's hard to see and gauge board member reaction, but across the room, I could see eyebrows lifted and nods and just affirmation of the work that you're doing. So the first thing I'd like to say is a congratulations to the Rowan Salisbury School Board for hiring you.
Oh, thank you.
You can look at professional educators and any resume, but when you have homegrown and an investment and a history that translates into passion that's going to be poured back into that district, it's exciting to hear that inflection in your voice.
Thank you.
Dr. Smith I don't mean this as a negative for you, but Dr. Smith walked us through the PowerPoint and we were already impressed. But the background that you brought and the broad strokes that you painted provided the color to the work that's being done. So I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
We talked about retention. We talked about your focus on human capital. What do you need in your district most to continue this work?
Well, honestly, you're not going to be surprised by the answer likely, but honestly, one of the biggest pieces, the TSL grant really enabled us to focus in on how do we retain staff. I don't personally believe that everyone does anything for money. I certainly don't, and educators often don't, but we have to be competitive, and we have to have a competitive advantage in that space. So making sure that we can provide the professional development, which is a budget that is often cut for our teachers so that they are learning and being challenged and supported, is incredibly important. And then any way that we can show value in the work. I just said the release of the Portrait of a Graduate was, and that's not a joke, that was like affirming for them that the work that we are doing, while you were talking about the multiple measures model, I was texting the team and saying, I hope you're watching, not to see me, but to see what they just said, because we are still doing that work. So any way that you can support making sure that people understand, a board member said earlier, that we are moving forward, that we do hear the concern, but certainly from a budgetary perspective, I think we have to focus in on how do we equip teachers. Things have changed dramatically in the last couple of years. And so in the meetings that I'm having with teachers, they are saying, I want to do the right work. I need to know how to do the right work. So professional development. And then we're always working on compensation. Our district always working on it, but so is the neighboring district and the neighboring state. So we just have to keep that at the forefront of understanding. And we know that there's not an endless source of money, but making sure that teachers feel professionally valued, whether that's in the form of salary, but certainly in the form of investment in professional development. When I talked about that year where we traveled all over the country to see schools, I didn't lose any teachers at the end of that year, because they were learning, they were growing. They were able to go to New Orleans to see a school on a barge and a school in a detention center. They were able to go to Rhode Island and see the Met, which is the best example of personalized learning I've ever seen. They were able to go to California. They were able to go to all these places, and the number of times, all of them were different. We charted to make sure different people got to go, and all of them said, I feel like a professional. I mean, they'd never been on an airplane as a teacher before. They'd never been invited to go to something like that. And you're on there with all of the business people that are pulling their suitcases behind them and do it all the time, and they're like nervous because that's just not part of their experience. But because of that, teachers felt invested in their learning. So support of that is what we need.
I have one more tough question, and then I'll quit hogging the microphone.
You're good.
The cornerstone of renewal are supposed to be the flexibilities that are offered. What flexibility do you wish you had that you do not currently have?
Testing. I mean, we honestly wish we could have paused that process and restarted it. We don't want to not test. But if you've ever looked at any research about an implementation, when you do large-scale change, there's an implementation dip. The year that we went 1-to-1, it took us 2 years to come out of that, and we started to see some change in those schools. But the testing piece is unfortunate for our students, and it's unfortunate for our staff because it actually limits their creative abilities.
Thank you. Colleagues, what other questions do you have? Thanks for indulging me as I ask those two. Dr. Oxendine.
I have a quick question. What caught my eye, a lot did, actually, but at the peak of your attendance, your student attendance, 97.5, and you were saying a lot of really positive things were beginning to happen pre-pandemic. Have you thought, can you go back to any of those really positive
Absolutely.
things?
Yes.
To get back to that?
Absolutely. Again, having a shift in leadership, and it's no one's fault. It's just the fact that different leaders lead differently and have different focuses. So Absolutely. That is exactly what we're doing right now, is trying to recenter our principals on it is okay. Some of that was honestly travel-based. We had students outside of the building, either doing service projects or experiences, and COVID alone did not allow that to happen. We shut down a lot of that because they weren't allowed to go anywhere. And we only saw them 2 days a week in some senses, so we weren't going to send them out on the 2 days that we had them. And with 64% of our students having socioeconomic challenges, we can't send them on their own to places because they just can't get there. We're a rural district, so we don't have a lot of public transportation or places to get there. Absolutely, the plan is to reignite that passion for making sure our students have experiences, which I do think led to us seeing an increase, not only in student attendance, but our teachers were fulfilled and were excited about what they were doing.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Hall.
Thank you, ma'am. Just one quick question, and maybe I missed it. When do you start your school year? When do you end?
Our start date is in early August. Of course, it varies depending on, I think we were August 10th. I wasn't there this year when they started, but I think they started on August 10th. And we are out the week before Memorial Day.
Superintendent Truitt.
Just a quick comment. If anyone is interested in how competency-based education is the ultimate in instructional equity for children and agency, then they need to go visit Morgan Elementary. That is was such a memorable experience, and hearing a 10-year-old describe their learning journey about any given topic in a way that shows that they have that self-efficacy and that learning mindset, which, by the way, research shows that's what leads to outcomes, to good student outcomes, one of the biggest pieces. And we saw that time and time again in all the classrooms that we visited. And that visit really showed me what the power of competency-based education in those grades in particular.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your time today
Thank
and
you.
for sharing with us the work that you're doing. We wish you Godspeed in the year ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all.
So we have one more item of new business. This will be really quick. This is a rules review commission update. Ashley Beccaro is going to share with you the good work that's been done in getting the charter school application timeline through the rules review process. Ms. Beccaro.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So we've talked about this several times. This is the rule for charter schools application and review process. This board approved the changing of the timeline to a deadline in the last Friday in July to change it to the last Friday in April. This was approved in July 2021, so over a year now. And that amendment to the Rules Commission was put on pause to allow the legislative review process to happen, which is a requirement for rules. It has gone to the Rules Committee and the Rules Review Commission, and they approved it at their November 17th meeting. So that is now final. The deadline for charter school applications each year will be the last Friday in April. Our office will publicize, like we normally do, online in the month of December. It will open in January. There's a portal for charter school applications, and then that will close the last Friday in April, and the process starts over again. Any questions?
Any questions? Great. Thanks for the update. We're excited that we got that through.
All right, thank you.
All right, let's shift to our action items. We have two. EICS 1 is a report that was provided last month by Dr. Mia Murphy on our report to the General Assembly on our NC virtual public schools. We had an opportunity to see that presentation and talk about it. Dr. Murphy shared with us that we didn't have any additional questions. Is there anyone that has a question about that report today before we send it over to our friends in the General Assembly? Okay, hearing none. Let's move to EICS 2. We'll bring Ms. Beccaro back up to the podium to walk us through The schools that are before us for approval on an accelerated timeline. North Carolina Administrative Code 16 NCAC OCG 0508 prepares an accelerated planning year for applications for schools. It's on an accelerated timeline. There were 4 schools that appeared before CSAB. 3 of those schools are before us today. American Leadership Academy in Monroe, Legacy Classical Academy, and Mountain City Public Montessori are the 3 that are before us for approval. There was a 4th school, Unity Global Academy, that did not receive a recommendation from CSAB, so we're only discussing those 3. Ms. Vaquero, I'll turn it over to you today.
All right, thank you very much. This was up for discussion last month. There are 3 schools pending your vote tomorrow. There's American Leadership Academy in Monroe. This is, American Leadership Academy Monroe, which will be located in Union Academy. This applicant has partnered with the EMO Charter 1 and plan to open K through 8 with 450 schools. I do have some updates on that school. Just at this point, they have over 2,000 students on an interest wait list. They have hired a school director. Charter 1 currently has 6 schools that have been approved under their EMO contract in North Carolina. They've started some of those, and then some of those they have entered into a management partnership with the school board after the school had already been up and running. They currently operate 17 schools in Arizona. 15 of those have AB scores, and 2 of those have C scores. And most recently, they opened Wake Prep and ALA Johnston, which were the largest charter school openings we've had in the state. The second school we have is, is Legacy Classical Academy. This would be located in Rockingham, opening with K through 4. Would be the only elementary charter school in the county, and they would be partnering with the EMO American Traditional Academies. This would be the first school that this management company has opened, although the staff of the management company, the partners, have extensive charter school experience. And finally, there's the Two Rivers Montessori, which is in Buncombe County, Asheville City, slated to open, or projected opening of K to 5, 106 students. And that was a unanimous approval by the CSAB. I just wanted to remind the board, this comes up most years, there is a policy that prior to denying any charter school application that received a majority vote to approve by the CSAB, the state board will return the application to the CSAB for further review. So pending the vote tomorrow, if any are denied by this board, then what happens is our office brings it back to CSAB, which would be probably maybe December. We have our meeting next week, but if not, in January, and then we bring it back to you guys for a second review. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may still have pending.
Thank you, Ms. Vaquero. I see hands, Mr. Blackburn.
Could you tell us the vote from CSAP for the other 2? You said one was
Yep.
unanimous, the other 2. Could you tell us the vote?
Yes, sir. For ALA Monroe, this is the one in Union County, there were 7 in support, 2 opposed, and 2 were recused. And then for the Legacy Classical Academy, there was 10 in support and 1 opposed.
Thank you for the question. Other questions? Ms. Kamnitz.
I will repeat a concern that I expressed a month ago on ALA, and the fact that this has been we've had a very rapid expansion of Charter 1 schools in North Carolina, and with large numbers of students affected, and this is another quick opening. And I have concerns that we don't really know enough about the academic performance performance in these schools to move forward with another one. I have some concerns about the governance model and the amount of authority that the EMO has compared to the board. Gives me some pause about who's really going to be in control of the school, and I'll stop there. But I have I have real concerns about this particular school.
Yes.
I just have a question related to that. So, Ms. Cambridge, you mentioned the concern about expedited opening. Is this the school that was acquired? So that's why we don't have data? No. Why don't we have? What's the concern
I mean,
about
just the nature of COVID. I mean,
performance?
our data, we don't have any. Just as we don't with other schools, COVID has affected
Gotcha.
us.
Okay.
But in this case, when we're talking about another school being managed by this group, and you know, I have to say that comparing to the Arizona schools is not fair. If it is not meaningful unless Arizona is using the same school performance measurement rubric as we are, and I don't think that's the case. So success in Arizona does not necessarily translate to success to similar success in North Carolina.
So my counter argument to that would be then we should stop benchmarking with other states across the nation, period. Because North Carolina's accountability model is unique to North Carolina. And we look all the time to other states to see what they're doing. And students are students. And so when you have charter schools in any state, if they're held to that state standards, then you would have to look at Arizona's model and say, well, Arizona must not have high standards for their students. And so to say that we shouldn't be comparing or look to success in another state is an infallible argument, because we look at, good grief, we heard that today, that we were looking at other states of what they're doing, and they have Vice Chair Duncan and I had a conversation about this. They are more weighted on growth and about moving students in a positive direction. You're right, out of the 6 for the charter schools that Charter One operate, 2 were incredibly low performing schools that the organization wanted to assume responsibility for. The third one they acquired by the charter school approached them about being their management organization. They have 2 new ones. I encourage you to visit them. One is Wake Prep, which is just over the Wake County line in Franklin County, and the other one is in Johnson County. They are amazing facilities that the Charter One organization invested about $100 million in before they received any money from the state at all. So, other questions? Vice Chair Duncan.
So, there's a few thoughts, and thank you for pointing out the conversation we had. The Arizona accountability standards, which, as you said, different places have different standards, and they suit, at least at one point in time, what that state wants. And Arizona's are 30% proficiency, 50% growth, which is considerably different than the standards we have here. Then they have a college career readiness factor of 10%, which I'm sure is something our committee is considering that is looking at these issues. And then there's an ELL growth and proficiency component of 10%. And I'm going to suppose in Arizona that's particularly important given the very significant Hispanic population for that state. So, and increasingly, truthfully, it is for our state as well, with an increasing Hispanic population. So that's, I don't think they're as comparable. If all our schools were graded on that kind of curve, I think our results would be different. In fact, there's some recent demographic maps published in North Carolina that would demonstrate that they would be significantly different depending upon what percentages were selected for what measure. I want to ask a question or two if I could. And the first one is, you'll recall that we had conversations recently over a contract that came to the board that had a number of issues related to whether it even complied with North Carolina law. And I believe the board asked at that point that all contracts be reviewed by our legal staff. Have these contracts been reviewed for these schools by our legal department?
Yes, sir. We send we send all the contracts that are included in our applications to the legal staff.
As I read the minutes, there seemed to be within the CSAP group some considerable concern about exactly how they are to interpret contracts and what standards they should give. So one comment I'm going to make out of this is I think there would be some wisdom in appointing some group of the board to try to help bring clarity to this issue, that is what it is in contracts, to provide some guidance to CSAP, which just based on reading the minutes, it seems like they're really asking for.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, that was I would say, a significant discussion point at the last CSAB meeting. And I definitely captured in the minutes, but also if you listen to the meeting on YouTube, which of course is much more detailed, you can see kind of the struggle and understanding among the board members. What is our role in kind of evaluating contracts, or what is the board's role? What is staff's role? As you know, we're not contract attorneys. The board does their best, I think, to read the contracts and try to point out things to the nonprofit boards that are coming up as applicants that may, be troublesome or that they want them to look into. And then, of course, our office sends it to legal to make sure that if there's anything they need to advise the board on in, closed session or remind them to, think about asking, that takes place.
So, to clarify what I'm about to say, I only got one of the contracts this morning, was trying to read it during the meeting about one of these three applicants. The other one I did get a couple of days ago and have gone through. It was not in our original board materials, and I would ask that they be in original board materials from this point forward if we could.
So on eBoard, we link to all the applications. They should be with the applications and the application files online, but we can definitely pull those out and put them.
I'm going to ask if I could get a copy, please.
Okay.
I copy all the materials because I can only mark on paper. I'm not good at marking on a computer. And the materials I copied for the charter schools were 1,100 pages of our 1,700 pages total agenda.
Yep.
So I would say out of that, there's obviously a lot of work being done by CSAB members having to review a lot of materials. But it's a significant challenge when board members only get this a few days before the meeting to try to get through the 1,100 pages. And I did not see the contracts from what I had, so I would like to be able to look at the contracts. And I'm not going to try to go through all the contracts here, and my comment is not necessarily that there's a violation of North Carolina law, but I think the governance issue is very mixed. It raises a lot of issues because it is the for-profit EMO is undertaking large numbers of functions. In fact, one could argue almost all governance functions, including hiring, firing, and everything else, and leaving to the actual board very little. The chair of the board is a former general counsel of Charter 1, according to the minutes, who lives in Wyoming now, is out of state, and does not bring that local touch, if you will, that we sometimes refer to about charter schools, given state of residence. Now, no longer, according to the records that we have, no longer a member of the Charter 1 staff as general counsel, but rather a private practitioner back in a law firm. But that law firm does Charter 1 work still. None of that makes me feel comfortable about the situation in terms of governance in this case. I know it's been commented that this is similar, at least, to contracts we've had otherwise. And by the way, the contract that was sent in by Charter 1 was not about this school. It was about the Wake County School. And I suspect that means it's a standard contract, and when they sent it into the office, they failed to change the name of the body with which they were contracting. And I don't don't suggest that couldn't be easily fixed, but I'm assuming the rest of the contract would be the same. But I'm not comfortable with the governance as it's structured in these contracts, and to the extent they were approved before, that was before the board started asking to be able to see all the contracts, and issues arose that I think are important for all the board members and for the Office of Charter Schools to be aware of with respect to these contracts. I also have two other concerns, one of which, and I'm going to be very straightforward, is lawful. You can have a for-profit EMO. Our law allows for that. Most states don't, but ours does. It's being revisited in several states, but to my knowledge, it's not being revisited in ours. That being said, I think the board still has to consider the issue of the inherent issue that if you have a for-profit EMO, that means the money is going someplace and the decision has to be made whether or not that money, in this case, is a 15% percentage fee for every piece of revenue that comes in. And I have a question about that as to whether or not with federal funding you can actually, for example, Title I dollars, can an outside entity actually take 15% of Title I funds? This contract would suggest yes. I don't know the answer, but I sure would like to know it. And there's other federal funding that also 15% would be taken from, in addition to 15% from state funds, 15% from the local funding. And so those issues are important. And this contract also authorizes further payments by the body that's seeking the charter. So that causes me to be very concerned about the inherent conflict that already exists. That is the ethical conflict. Is these dollars, how do we make the hard choice of whether we have these dollars go to we as the profit-making EMO body, or whether we allocate those to children? And the for-profit situation complicates, given the structure of this contract. I think it is a factor, and I believe it's, even though I'm not suggesting that there's an illegality about the contract, I am suggesting it's something we can consider, and I'm not comfortable with it. Finally, I know in this application there's a suggestion that there would be a building that's already existing that would be leased, but in order to accommodate the number of students that the school would like to accommodate, there's also the request that, or suggestion at least, that within a year there would be a building that would be built in some way in association with this. And all of this is unclear from the documentation that I've seen, exactly what the details of that would be. But there is some history with respect to Charter I, with respect to how it builds its schools and how they're paid for. So it would be extraordinarily important to me to fully understand before I be in favor of this. For these and other reasons, I will not be voting for this item, and I felt I had some obligation to at least explain why. And I would suggest that the board be in a position to provide further guidance and have some communication with CSAP with respect to contracts. Glad to hear any responses anyone may have.
Thank you, Vice Chair Duncan. I know that, thank you for articulating your concerns about the contract. I'm not sure that Ms. McCarrow should be in the position of having to
I don't mean to put it there.
I just want to protect her, that her role here is bringing forward the recommendations from the Charter School Advisory Board, and and that she's doing so accordingly. Superintendent Truitt, I believe you had a question.
Yeah, I too appreciate the legal ruminations about the contract and the Title I funding, et cetera. I have to push back a little on the what appears to be pushback on the fact this is a for-profit EMO. There's all of public education has for-profit entities intertwined in it.
Yes.
And I don't, quite frankly, think that the 2,000 families that have expressed an interest in attending this school in Monroe care whether or not this is a for-profit entity or a nonprofit entity. And the fact that they've put over $105 million into their two schools in North Carolina says that they're putting their money where their mouth is. I mean, I don't know that the fact that it's, I mean, I struggle more with our nonprofit charters who don't have
experience,
the track record, the the funds to prioritize students. And here we have a situation where we have an EMO with a track record, with stability, with funding, that is willing to assume schools or to acquire schools that are struggling, and they're supporting those schools financially. And I just think that as the board is considering this, they need to think about the fact that while the board does have a duty to safeguard the public from charter schools that are not capable of doing what they're supposed to be doing, at the end of the day, parents are going to choose whether or not they want to attend the school. And there is a waiting list, Ms. Beccaro, is that correct?
Yeah, over 2,000.
Yeah. Thank you, Ms. White.
I didn't see any reference from $105 million in the materials. Can you apprise the board?
That was for Wake,
to?
for Wake Prep and ALA Johnston, American Leadership Academy Johnston.
That's an applicant, correct?
No, those are two
Those
schools
are
that are
two.
existing this year.
It's in the process of starting, yes.
Of
No,
their,
they're up and they opened this fall.
Okay.
So to Ms. Camden's point, there isn't any academic data yet.
I still don't understand what the $105 million reference is, just if you could clarify that.
That those are not state funds. They were not using state funds to build those facilities, that those were Charter One funds that were used to pour into infrastructure because charter schools don't get money for facilities.
And what are the lease back amounts for those funds?
I wouldn't know.
Well, that would be important to know because that comes out of the operating expenditure.
I believe it was shared with us that at Wake Prep it was $3 million a year rent, at least in that summer's paying, which is, say
So-
that the company is recouping their investment.
But at least they made the investment.
And but the company does have a, it would be one thing if it were a real estate company and that was it, but their program is much more than that. They have a curriculum team. They have a human capital team. So you can think of it as a central office. I think you mentioned there was a concern about having a board member from out of state, but state law does allow for that. And I am aware that this particular company is building a statewide board for oversight because they have schools in Charlotte, they have one in Wilmington, and now they have two in the North Central region. So they're looking at building a statewide board that would provide oversight to the schools in our area. Dr. Oxendine.
Just a quick question to the point that you were making about the investment of Charter One into the school. Do we have and what piqued my interest is the conversation around curricula, supporting the infrastructure that supports the teaching and learning. Do we have any information, could we gather some information on that additional amount of money? Because that should be substantial, or is it already tied into the is there any way we can get that? Because it sounds like there are other investments.
I'm sure that we could ask Charter One to reply to that. But again, so great question. If you do that, then I would suggest to you that you have to ask that same question for every other entity that makes that application. And here we're asking questions because this particular company is large and it does have a footprint, but I would suggest to you, what do you know about the school that's going in Buncombe County? And its finances and its curriculum and its facility. Does it have plans for a new building? Does it have the support? What happens if all of a sudden they don't have any money? Then you've got 600 families that believe in the Montessori. So it is a question that we shouldn't holistically focus on one entity and more so one that we should be looking at. And
see, I see it as the more they're investing, I see it as a good thing, a positive side of the story.
To echo that, this board has already approved their approach 6 times up until now. So we have already had a chance to look at contracts 6 times. We've already had a chance to look at their academic plan is the same against all of the schools that they're partnered with.
Thank you.
Vice Chair Duncan.
Just to be clear, 2 points. One, I'm not alleging an illegality. I'm alleging, my concerns relate to whether or not this fits appropriately with the model and whether or not the governance structure works. Second thing, I just want to be clear, I don't think we actually approved 6 contracts. I didn't see any of the contracts before now. And the contract issues become much more significant in the past year when we had to present with a contract that did on its face violate state law and yet had come to us for approval. So, and I would say one last comment. The schools in North Carolina, the charter ones here, I think you're right, it has 2 Ds and a C, but I think it's important not to focus on that because they're taking over schools that were already in that context, and I did not make any allusion or reference to that. But there are, as you also pointed out, there are several other schools that are just now starting. And so the question is, how many more do we, I mean, it's another reasonable question to ask is, how many more do you want to start up at, I believe, request of, or the number of over 1,000 for sure has been used, until you have some form of a track record of what the school's doing in North Carolina. I think that's not an unreasonable question to ask. And I agree with you, last point, I agree with you that if you have concerns about the contracts and the way this is set out here, you have to ask it all of. It's just to save time when we get to the American Traditional Academy, I have the exact same questions, and so I won't repeat it. I'm in the same place with that than I am here. That will save some time.
Thank you. So we've had extensive discussion about this particular one. There are 2 other schools. Vice Chair Duncan brought up the second one, but are there any other questions that you'd like to have a discussion about at the board table today before we close this out? Okay. Hearing none, my computer's gone to sleep. Give me a second to bring that up. Thank you, Ms.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. White, can I say one thing?
Sure.
Fairness to American Traditional, their
Yes.
percentage is 14%, not 15%. That's the distinction in their contract. But other than that, there's no discernible difference in terms of how it may affect governance.
Yeah, yes, sir. I'll just, one more little point is that, you know, we are, as an agency, the Department of Public Instruction and the State Board of Education contract with lots of different entities to do the good work in our state. And all of those outside agencies, companies that do audits or companies that do curriculum support, when they have a contract, or even might I add, when we write a grant, there's always a percentage in there that provides, and so that is the nature of doing business. And so it's the separation between business contracting and education work. But I would suggest to you that DPI does its work by contracting with other agencies that have a built-in margin for continuing to do operations.
And I appreciate that. My point of reference, for the ESSER funds, we got half of 1% of the funds for the administrative function, which is quite different from 15 or 14%.
And we also can, if the contractor is not performing, we have the power to change that, and I question whether or not the board would have that power when the EMO owns the building. I think it would be very difficult.
I promise to say nothing else. Thank you for your
Yep.
patience with me.
Anyway. We could be here all day. Anyway, but when things are going well, there wouldn't be a need to unbuckle. And so I go back to Arizona's record of A schools, B schools, and 2 C schools. So anyway, and boards do have the right to use the different either EMO or CMO at any time. But your point is well taken. Okay, no more questions? Right, I'm standing between you and lunch. Shall we move to EICS 3, which is a discussion item? This is Aspire Trade High School's request to implement a weighted lottery, and Ms. Vaquero.
Okay, thank you. Aspire Trade High School is currently in its planning year, so this is a school that is going through the process of opening, projected to open this upcoming fall in Mecklenburg County. It is a high school model. It will open with grades 9 to 10 and a projected enrollment of 210. Their mission is specifically targeting career and technical training with hands-on experiences and apprenticeships in their facility. They are currently on track to open. I've been out to the facility. They're going to have a really interesting learning experience where companies will come in, like train, HVAC, and things like that to give hands-on apprenticeships to their students. And they are taking the steps of implementing a weighted lottery to make sure that they can target economically disadvantaged students. They've, during the planning year, they've hired 2 planning staff members dedicated to outreach and recruitment, community organization partnership, and transportation to include busing. And as is required, weighted lottery amendments require state board approval to implement. Any questions?
Excellent information, and we love this model, this model for Aspire Trade. Questions about their request to put a lottery in place? I am not seeing any. Thank you very much, Ms. Beccaro.
Okay, thank you.
One last item, which is on consent. This is EICS4, and these are appointments to the Advisory Council for the North Carolina Virtual Public Schools. Those resumes are attached to the board documents for your review, but they're before us for consent. And without any questions from that, I will turn the microphone back over to you, Mr. Chair. We are done for the day.
Thank you, Ms. White. Our final discussion for the morning is the healthy, responsible students, and with that, I'll turn to Mr. Reginald Keenan. Mr. Keenan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Reginald Keenan, along with Alan Duncan, co-chair of the HRS committee. Mr. Chair, for tomorrow we have an action item, and of course we discussed in the last meeting about the school mental health policy that's required to go to the General Assembly. And there's any questions or comments, we ask tomorrow if you accept it tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. Keenan. We'll now break for lunch, and let's reconvene at 1:30. 1:30.